3:26 a.m. on August 7th, 1985, a very distraught man called the police and he said, "I think my father is in mortal danger. He lives down the road from me. I was just on the phone with him and it seems like something is totally wrong. Can you please go check on him?" The police tell him to calm down and explain really what's going on here, what happened on the phone. And so the man, whose name was Jeremy, said his dad called him and he was talking about his daughter, so Jeremy's sister, and her name was Sheila. And he's like, "Sheila's gone crazy. She's gone berserk and I think she has a gun." And Jeremy's telling police that he didn't know what his dad was talking about and he's trying to get more information from his dad. He's like, "What do you mean she's got a gun? What's going on over there?" But at some point in this phone call with his father, the phone line just cuts out. And Jeremy's left with all these questions that have gone unanswered. He tried calling back, but it didn't go through, and that's when he called the police. The police asked Jeremy if he had heard any shots fired in the background before the phone cut out. And Jeremy says, "No, but my sister is schizophrenic, she's got a bad temper, and she had been fighting with my parents all week, in particular with my dad. And right before the phone cut out, my dad sounded really scared, like something bad was about to happen or was happening. And so we need to get over there right now." And so the police say, "Okay, we're going to check it out right now." So they hang up with Jeremy and the police head down the road towards White House Farms, where Jeremy's father lives. They park a little ways away from the house itself, safely behind a wall and some trees, because they don't want to go too close in case Sheila really does have a gun and starts shooting at them. As the police are getting out of their vehicle, another car comes driving down the road from the same direction the police had come from. The police tell them to stop and the person gets out and it turns out it's Jeremy. He didn't live that far away and he comes running over and he's like, "We gotta go in there. You have to go in there right now." And the police are like, "We're not gonna do that. You stay with your car." Before the police were prepared to go into this house, they wanted to scope it out and get a sense of what was going on because they really didn't know anything about the house besides what Jeremy told them. So a small group of police officers goes behind this other building that's kind of adjacent to the White House Farms, but pretty close to the actual farmhouse. And they go around the backside and they peek around the corner and they start looking at the house. And it's still dark outside. And there's a couple of lights on inside the house and there's no movement, there's no sound, and they're just staring at it. And then one of the officers notices movement, or what he thinks is movement, up in the second floor. And the group of them back up behind the building. They didn't want to be seen. They were worried if Sheila saw them, it would trigger her to harm the other people in the house or harm herself. So they back up away from this building, making sure to stay out of sight of that second floor window and really out of sight of any of the windows on this farmhouse. And they go back to the intersection where the police cars are and where Jeremy is, and they decide they're going to take the diplomatic approach. And so they call in a negotiator who, with a bullhorn, goes up behind that little building and they start calling out to Sheila, trying to get her to peacefully put her weapon down and come outside. But there's no sound in the house. There's no more movement in the house as far as anyone can tell. And this turns into a multi-hour long standoff where no one comes out of the house, no one goes into the house, and then the sun comes up and the police are starting to get frustrated. And so they eventually call the negotiator back and they say, "Okay, we're going to need to make entry." A small group of police assaulters began making their way up towards the farmhouse. They get up to the door, it's locked. They try the other door, it's locked. All the windows are locked. And so they bring up a sledgehammer, they smash on the front door, and they make entry into this hallway. They immediately make a right, and they're getting ready to confront Sheila wherever she is, but they don't see her. They go all the way down this hallway, and it opens up into the kitchen. And hunched over the stove is a man who's clearly deceased, who winds up being Jeremy's father. He had been shot to death, and he's laying in the kitchen. So they find him. They scan the rest of the kitchen and they look all around the first floor and there's no one else down there. And this whole time, they're not hearing any other noises in the house. It's totally silent. They make their way upstairs, and as soon as they get to the top of the stairs, they go right into the first room on the right, and laying on the bed is a deceased older woman who's also been shot to death, and that would wind up being Jeremy's mother. Laying on the ground next to the bed was a woman who appeared to be in her late 20s, who would wind up being Jeremy's sister, so Sheila, the one who had gone berserk apparently according to the father. She's laying on the ground and she has a rifle that's over her chest and the barrel is pointed up towards her head, and she has a gunshot wound that's going in underneath her chin, and so she's deceased as well. The police leave that room, they go across the hall into another bedroom, and when they go inside they find two more bodies that are both laying in their beds. They were 6-year-old twins. They were Sheila's sons. They had both been shot to death as well. After that, there was nobody else in the house, so all of the family has been wiped out. Very quickly, this case was labeled a clear-cut murder-suicide perpetrated by Sheila. She had a history of mental illness, she had apparently gone berserk that night, and she had a gun. Everything fit. And so the police were ready to just write this off as a murder-suicide, especially with the amount of media attention this case got. There was a lot of pressure to just solve this case and move on. And so murder-suicide became the answer, and they were not looking for any other answer. But there was one detective that was not willing to accept that this was clearly a murder-suicide, and he had a couple reasons for it. The first thing he noticed, because he was there when the bodies were discovered, was Sheila was carrying a rifle that had a 10-round magazine, and Sheila did not have any pockets on the clothes she had on when they found her. That's important because she fired 25 shots. So that required 2 reloads, except the ammunition to this gun was downstairs, and a lot of the shooting happened upstairs. So after her first volley of fire on the second floor, where presumably you have at least a couple people that are still totally alive, she had to walk downstairs, reload the gun, come back upstairs, do her second volley of fire, go back downstairs, reload that second time, and then she finishes her course of fire. And it made him wonder, why didn't anybody try to stop her while she was doing the reload? Because it required going all the way down, getting the rounds, jamming them into the magazine, putting it into the gun, and then going back upstairs. That's a lot of time that other people could have potentially tried to stop her, or at a minimum, just tried to escape. But it was like everybody just laid in bed. It was like they didn't know what was happening despite so many rounds being fired very close to them. Stan also found out Sheila did not have extensive weapons training. And so she wouldn't be natural at reloading a weapon. And so for her to go down and reload twice and not chip any of her nails, she had long painted nails, that seemed like a bit of a stretch because that requires pretty coordinated movements. And for her to never have done that before and just to be able to easily reload, that seems like a stretch too. Stan also figured out there was a window that had a faulty latch on it, that if you pulled lightly on it, it would stay locked. But if you pulled hard and kind of jostled it around, it could open and it could shut, which means the house was not secure when they got there, even though they thought it was. And that was a big part of their whole, this is a murder-suicide, because Sheila locked all the doors and windows before she committed this crime. But if any of those doors or windows were open, it kind of leaves open the opportunity for someone else to have gotten in there and gotten out before the police. But the biggest discovery by far that puts all the others to shame is something Stan found under the stairs inside the house. And everything before that, all the evidence that Stan was presenting to the other officers saying, hey, we should take a look at this. I don't know if this is a murder-suicide. I think there might be potential for somebody else to be responsible. Well, no one was taking him seriously until he came to the table with what he found underneath the stairs. Everybody had to stop what they were doing and say, okay, yeah, we need to look closer at this. And so if you want to learn more about that, go ahead and click on the link inside of the description. It will bring you to the landing page where you can watch this series that I've been raving about. It's on HBO Max and it's called The Murders at the White House Farm. And it does a great job of showcasing this huge find and then the follow-on plot twist. On the morning of November 13th, 1974, 6 members of the DeFeo family were asleep in their home in Amityville, New York. The 7th member of the family, Ron, was sitting on his bed in the basement. At around 1 a.m., he gets up off his bed, he grabs a rifle, and he starts walking up the stairs. He goes across the first floor, goes up the second floor stairs, and he gets to the second floor landing, and he walks right into his parents' bedroom, which was totally dark besides this little candle that had been lit next to his father's bedside, and he raises his rifle and he puts 2 rounds into his father's back. And then as soon as his father is still, he aims at his mother and he shoots her 2 times. And then he puts the gun down and he walks out and he goes across the hall into his brother's room. He raises his rifle and he fires 1 shot into his 12-year-old brother Mark, and then he aims at his 9-year-old brother John and he fires 1 shot into him as well. Then he leaves their bedroom and he walks down the hall to another bedroom where he finds his 13-year-old sister Allison. He raises his rifle and he fires 1 shot. He leaves her room, he goes up the 3rd set of stairs up onto the 3rd floor. He finds his 18-year-old sister Dawn and he fires 1 shot into her. And then he was done. Altogether, it took Ron about 15 minutes to massacre his family. At no point was he panicked or running around or acting crazy. He was just walking calmly room to room, taking very well-aimed shots to ensure they didn't get up again. He put the rifle down and he went outside and he jogged to a bar where he went inside and he put on this big facade that he had just found his family and they were hurt and could you come help him? And when they got to the house, he refused to go inside, but the people from the bar went inside and they discovered this horrible scene. And when the police show up, Ron goes over to them and he actually confesses and says, "I killed my family." Even though the DeFeo family had a reputation for being very dysfunctional, it was Ron who had the worst reputation. He was known around Amityville for heavy drug use, for being a total alcoholic, and for getting really aggressive and confrontational with people. He was just a guy no one wanted to be around. And so when news got out in Amityville that this horrible thing has happened, and it looks like Ron is the one who did it, no one was really that shocked. But when details of the crime scene, specifically the way the bodies were positioned, made people wonder, is there more to this case that we don't know about? All of the DeFeo family members had been found lying face down in their beds, and none of them showed any signs of putting up a struggle against their attacker, which led investigators initially to think that they must have been sedated, that Ron must have drugged them somehow before he carried out this attack. But when the toxicology reports came back, no one in the family had any substance in their system. At first, the police did not think that was a very big deal. They figured, you know what? The family just must not have heard the different gunshots. He wasn't shooting lots of rounds. It was, one single round here, one single round here, that perhaps they just didn't hear it, and that's why no one tried to escape. But it turns out the rifle Ron was using, the .35 caliber Marlin, is one of the loudest rifles you can own. And in fact, investigators went out and did a test with it, and they fired it indoors, and you could easily hear it a mile away. And so investigators said, well, then it looks like they must have heard these gunshots, but for some reason, didn't get out of their beds. They didn't try to fight back in any way. They just kind of took it. And then you have the weirdness of Ron's confession. On the night of the attack, when Ron is sitting on his bed and he can't sleep and everybody else is asleep upstairs, he starts hearing a voice in his head that's saying, "Catch them, kill them." And he thinks he's just losing his mind. But then out of the shadows, straight across from him, from underneath the steps in the basement, this shadowy figure emerges and starts walking towards him, and he can see what looks like its mouth moving and saying the words, "Catch them, kill them." And Ron's looking up at it as this figure walks all the way up to him and bends down and gets right next to his ear. And he says right into his ear, "Catch them, kill them." And then Ron said involuntarily he reached over to the rifle that was on the bed with him, and he stood up and he began walking towards the steps. And he knew what was going to happen. He was going to go kill his family, and he didn't want to do it. But he felt like he didn't have any more control over his body, and that's when he realized he was being possessed by this demon in the basement. While Ron's confession terrified everybody in Amityville, the idea that there was a demon living in the basement of this house that possessed someone to go kill their family, that terrified everybody, but it didn't hold up in court, and ultimately Ron was sent to jail for life. 1 year after the attacks, another family, the Lutz family, moved into the house in Amityville. But they left 28 days later because they were hearing voices coming from the basement. After hearing about the mass murder that occurred in the house, and now the Lutz family saying that there's something in the basement, world-renowned demonologists Ed and Lorraine Warren, they descend on the property, and very quickly Ed and Lorraine say, yes, this house is definitely haunted. And in fact, to this day, the Amityville house is considered one of the most haunted places in the entire world. But while Ed and Lorraine were there, they took a very famous picture. Lorraine was walking around the second floor near where the brothers' room was, and she was snapping pictures, and the only people in the house at the time these pictures were being taken were her and her husband, Ed. And here is the picture that she took on the second floor. She claims this boy standing on the left side of the picture is the ghost of John DeFeo. Today, the house still stands, and it's been bought and sold a number of times over the years because apparently no one likes to live in this house for a very long time. On June 10th, 1912, the Moore family was sleeping peacefully in their beds on their quiet street in Villisca, Iowa. Joe and Sarah Moore, the mother and the father, were asleep upstairs in their room, and their 4 children were down the hall in another room. In addition to the Moore family sleeping upstairs, there was also 2 more children sleeping on the first floor in the guest room. It was the Stillinger sisters, and they were over for a sleepover. And unbeknownst to all the sleeping people in the house, there was a strange man who had broken into the house while they were at church, gone into the attic, and was hiding in there, smoking cigarettes and carrying an axe. Shortly after midnight, this stranger believed the coast was clear, and they silently opened up the small door and they crouched down and walked out of the attic into the second floor hallway, wielding this axe in their left hand. They began walking down the hallway. They passed the children's room on their right, and they made their way down to the end of the hall where the master bedroom was. They walked inside the room and stood right next to Joe, and then violently raised the axe over their head so quickly and so high that it actually struck the ceiling, and then brought it down blade first directly onto Joe's face, over and over and over again until Joe did not resemble a human being. While this was happening right next to her, Sarah's beginning to stir and look around what's going on. Meanwhile, the killer has now moved to the other side of the bed and is standing over Sarah and using the backside of the axe. So not the blade part, but the backside of the axe head. He raises it up and then brings it down on her head and repeatedly hits her over and over and over again until she too is indistinguishable and does not look like herself or even human. The killer is very calm. He takes the sheets and pulls them up over the faces of both of the people he just killed. And then he goes back out into the hall and he walks down and he goes into the children's room. One by one, he raises the axe and drops the axe on each of the children's heads. And then after they are deceased, he pulls the sheets up over their head. The killer leaves the room and goes downstairs to where the Stillinger sisters are, and then just like everybody else in the house, he raises the axe and drops it over and over and over again on the heads of each of these girls until they're no longer living as well. Afterwards, he raises the sheets over their faces, and now everyone in the house is deceased and has their face covered. At this point, the killer goes back upstairs and goes back into the master bedroom, and he stands in front of Joe and Sarah's bed, and after a little while, he begins striking them dozens more times, even though both of them were clearly deceased at this point. At this point, the killer shifted gears and began focusing on covering his tracks, cleaning up. And he began taking clothes out of closets and pulling whatever sheets he hadn't used. He began tacking these things up onto all of the windows and any spaces on the doors so that nobody could see in. He also began covering up the mirrors, which no one understood why he did that. After the house is totally covered up, the killer goes into the kitchen and he cooks himself a meal, but he doesn't eat the food. He cleaned off the axe and placed it up against the wall on the first floor. He then took a huge bowl, filled it up with water, and then washed his bloody hands and began to clean himself a little bit, and then he left the bloody water just sitting on the counter. And then, strangely, he took a huge slab of bacon from in the kitchen and he put it in the middle of the floor, and then next to it was a keychain. And some people think this might have to do with some ritual he was performing, but to this day, no one really knows why he did that. And then he took some keys from inside the house, walked out the door, turned around, locked it behind him, and disappeared. The Moore household normally was a very rambunctious place with all these kids running around, and the neighbors were very close. And so the next morning, when the neighbors did not see the Moore family coming outside to do their chores around 7 a.m., they were concerned, and they went over and they knocked on the door. There was no answer. They noticed everything had sheets over it, so they couldn't see inside. And so Joe's brother was hailed to the house, and he brought along a key, and he opened up the door and he walked inside, and he immediately saw the Stillinger sisters and what had been done to them. And he got incredibly sick and he ran outside, and they called police. Police come down and they find this horrible scene. Even though they have the murder weapon, they have the victims, their bodies are right here, there's blood, there's all sorts of stuff and things that the killer must have manipulated. And you would think there's enough here that you'd be able to refine your search to a couple different suspects and eventually figure out who did this, but they weren't able to. And to this day, we have no idea who did this. The house itself where the attack happened has not been updated since the attack. Somebody bought the property and then maintained it so it could be a tourist attraction. And so to this day, you can go to the Villisca axe murder house and you can stay there. You can sleep there overnight and you can actually tour the area, and it looks the same way it did when the murders happened. Many people believe that house is haunted. And in fact, in 2014, someone who was there staying overnight as a tourist inexplicably stabbed themselves and had to go to the hospital, and they don't even know why they did it. And so that's kind of added to the legend of the Villisca axe murder house, that the house itself will cause you to harm yourself.
On June 7, 2007, 48-year-old Bob Eidman sat at his desk across from a client at the small auto insurance company he owned in St. Charles, Missouri, a suburb of St. Louis. Bob and his client talked like they were old friends. That was how Bob was with all of his clients. Part of the reason for this was that Bob just loved talking to people. But he also knew that a lot of his clients came to him when they had no other option. And they were often stressed out about making car insurance payments, so he tried hard to put them at ease. Bob went out of his way to work with people who had bad credit, or a history of traffic violations, or maybe who had gotten a DUI. These were people who desperately needed auto insurance because without it they couldn't drive, but they simply couldn't get insured by larger companies. Bob was well aware of this and made sure he never ever took advantage of these people's desperation. Instead, he offered affordable rates, accepted cash payments, and worked with clients to come up with insurance plans that they could actually handle. And so because of this, Bob had gotten a reputation in town as being as much a benefactor as he was a businessman. In the office, Bob's client handed him an envelope of cash to cover her payment for the month. They talked a bit longer, and then the client left. Once the door was closed, Bob marked the payment in his books, opened a desk drawer where he kept his cash hidden, and tucked the money inside. After that, he looked down at his phone and realized it was later than he thought. So he quickly grabbed a stack of business cards off his desk, slipped them in his pocket, and walked out. Bob's office was on the second floor of a strip mall. So once he was outside, he walked right down the steps to the parking lot, got in his car, and pulled out onto the street. Even though St. Charles was only about 30 minutes from the major city of St. Louis, it felt like a small town. This was a place where a lot of residents kept their doors unlocked and even left their keys in their cars. As Bob drove, he saw loads of people outside enjoying the beautiful spring weather and walking along the Missouri River that wound its way through St. Charles. Bob was a member of the St. Charles Chamber of Commerce, so he loved seeing people taking advantage of the natural beauty the town had to offer. And as an active member of the community, he really believed this was the kind of place where someone could help others and still succeed in business. A few minutes later, Bob pulled into the parking lot of a car dealership in town, and when he did, he got a huge smile on his face, because he saw his wife Diane standing outside the showroom waiting for him. So Bob parked his car, hopped outside, and walked right over to his wife and gave her a kiss on the cheek. The two had been married for 28 years, but they'd only started working together about a year ago when Bob opened up his insurance business. And people who knew them thought they complemented each other perfectly. Bob was this big guy with messy gray hair who loved to talk, while Diane looked and acted like a total professional. And even though they went about things differently, they shared a drive and an appreciation for hard work. In fact, Diane had a full-time job at a hospital, but she still managed to carve out a few hours almost every day to help her husband in his office or to do some marketing for the insurance company, which is actually why they were there at the car dealership. Bob handed Diane half of the business cards he'd brought, and then the two of them split up and began talking to everyone at the dealership who might be looking for a new car. This was one of the ways they marketed Bob's company and found new clients. The two of them spent the rest of the day handing out cards and talking to people. By the time they were finished, they were worn out, but they felt like they'd put in a good, honest day of work. That night, back at home, Bob stayed up and brainstormed more possible marketing ideas, while Diane went to bed early. She had to be up and out of the house by 5 a.m. the next day to make her shift at the hospital. Bob knew how hard it had been for Diane, working basically non-stop across multiple jobs, but he told himself this would all be worth it. The risk he had taken by opening up his own business would eventually pay off, he knew it. Then he'd be able to give Diane a happier, easier life. At 10 a.m. the following day, June 8th, Bob walked into his office, went to his desk, and got right to work, going over his financial statements and planning client meetings. And he'd been working for about an hour when he heard the office door open. So he stopped what he was doing, and he looked up from his desk. At 12:30 p.m., so 2.5 hours after Bob had gotten to the office, a postal worker was making her daily rounds through the same strip mall. She delivered mail to all the businesses on the first floor and then headed upstairs to drop a package off for Bob. She opened Bob's door, said hello as she walked in, and then stopped cold right inside the doorway. She began to scream, dropped the package on the ground, and ran back down the stairs, yelling for help. People began coming out of their shops and offices to see what was going on. At the same time, this postal worker just happened to spot a police cruiser coming down the street towards the strip mall, so she sprinted across the parking lot and ran out into the road, shouting and waving her arms to get their attention. The police cruiser came to a screeching halt, and an officer got out and asked her what was wrong. And the postal worker, who could barely breathe, began to describe what she had just seen. A moment later, that same police officer was entering Bob's office. And just like the postal worker had done, the officer froze in the office doorway. He had been on the force for years, but what he saw in the office still hit him hard. Because on the floor right in front of him, Bob lay motionless, surrounded by a pool of blood. The officer quickly pulled himself together, ran across the office, and crouched down over Bob's body. He checked for a pulse, but it was clear Bob was dead. Not long after the officer contacted the station to report the death, Detective Donald Stepp of the St. Charles Police and his superior, Captain Pat McCarrick, arrived at the scene. These were two of the most experienced investigators on the force, but even they had not had to deal with many homicides in St. Charles. Because, at the time, the city had a far lower murder rate than the state of Missouri and the country as a whole. Detective Stepp and Captain McCarrick did a walkthrough of the office, and then they examined Bob's body. They saw multiple bullet wounds, but one of the shots looked like it had just grazed Bob. Stepp and McCarrick also found spent shell casings and also live rounds from a 9mm handgun spread out at different spots across the floor. Because of these live rounds on the floor, which are just unshot bullets, so intact, full live rounds, the investigators thought the killer's weapon might have jammed at some point, and so maybe in an attempt to clear the jam, they had ejected these live rounds onto the ground. Or perhaps the killer might have just been an inexperienced shooter and sort of unintentionally ejected these live rounds without shooting them. The investigators dug through Bob's desk, and they noticed there was no sign of a wallet or any form of ID. They checked Bob's pockets and didn't find a wallet there either, so they thought maybe this had been a robbery. But not long after that, they discovered the money in Bob's cash drawer. They didn't know why a robber would have taken Bob's wallet and left all this cash behind. But maybe there was a chance that the killer was not only an inexperienced shooter, but also an inexperienced thief. Soon, the investigators were joined by members of the county forensic team. Forensics officers examined and collected the shell casings as well as the live rounds. They dusted for prints and did a thorough search of Bob's body and clothes for possible DNA samples. While the forensics team worked in the office, Stepp and McCarrick made their way outside and began questioning owners and employees from the other businesses in the strip mall. The woman who owned the printing shop right below Bob's office proved to be the most helpful. She told investigators she had seen Bob pull into the parking lot around 10 a.m. And at about 11, she said she'd heard loud banging coming from upstairs in Bob's office. She said that she figured Bob was just moving file cabinets around or something, and as a joke, she'd even yelled up to him from her office, "Hey Bob, keep the noise down." But now that she knew what had really happened to Bob, she wished at the time she heard those noises, she had gone upstairs to check on him. The investigators asked her if she could think of anyone who might have had an issue with Bob, but the woman said no, Bob was one of the most likable people she knew, and she figured everyone the police would talk to would say the same thing, because that's just who Bob was. A few minutes later, as the investigators walked out of the print shop, Detective Stepp scanned the strip mall, and the front door of a Mexican restaurant caught his attention. Positioned right above the restaurant door was a security camera that pointed out towards the parking lot and the street. So the investigators went inside the restaurant and asked the owner if they could have his surveillance footage from that morning and also the night before. The owner said of course, and handed over the footage. By the time the investigators had spoken to everyone in the strip mall, it was about 3 p.m. Around that time, Stepp and McCarrick headed towards the stairs to rejoin the forensics team inside of Bob's office. But as they were walking, they heard an officer shouting their names from the parking lot. They turned around and saw the officer standing there with a woman, and as they made eye contact with this officer, he quickly came over to them. He said the woman he was with was Bob's wife, Diane. She'd been trying to get a hold of Bob, but he never answered, so she came up here to see if everything was okay. He said Diane obviously knew something was going on here because of the police presence, but she didn't actually know what had happened to Bob. Detective Stepp took a breath, and then he and his captain went to go speak with Diane. They introduced themselves, and then Stepp broke the news that her husband had been found dead in his office, and that someone had shot him. Then Stepp and McCarrick offered their condolences. But Diane's response took them completely by surprise. Diane barely reacted at all, and she didn't even say anything. Now, the investigators knew that people handled news like this in very different ways, but neither of them had ever seen something like this. It was like Diane was completely devoid of emotion. Stepp and McCarrick shared a quick look, and it was clear they both thought this was strange. But they were experienced enough not to jump to conclusions based on a single reaction or non-reaction from somebody who just heard such terrible news. Stepp broke the silence and told Diane they'd like to ask her some questions so they could try to figure out, where to start this investigation. Diane finally spoke and said she would help if she could. Stepp called over to the officer who had brought them Diane and asked him to go get them a chair. The officer ducked into one of the offices and quickly came back out again with a metal folding chair and placed it down next to Diane. Diane took a seat right there in the parking lot, and then Stepp and McCarrick began questioning her. As the victim's spouse, Diane was automatically a person of interest. So the investigators started with basic questions about her and Bob's marriage. How was their marriage going lately? Did they fight? Did they have financial problems? But Diane said she and Bob had a great relationship. They fought like any married couple would, but it was nothing serious. She said financially they were fine. And with Bob's growing business, they actually hoped to be in even better shape financially soon. Without missing a beat, Captain McCarrick asked if Bob had a life insurance policy, and if so, was Diane the beneficiary? This was a pretty standard question in this situation when dealing with a victim's spouse or children, because somebody killing a family member to collect the life insurance policy was definitely not unheard of. Diane said yes, Bob had life insurance, and she was the beneficiary, but it was a small policy. The payout was maybe $5,000. Now, immediately, neither of the investigators thought that was enough money for somebody to want to kill over, but they didn't want to rule anything out yet. At some point, Detective Stepp asked Diane if she knew of anyone who might want to hurt Bob, and he sort of expected her answer to be similar to the one the print shop owner had given. But Diane's answer was very different. She said she did know somebody. There was a man who might have it out for Bob. She said his name was Kevin Green, and he was a rival auto insurance salesman in town. Bob had recently accused Kevin of stealing one of his clients and had actually gone to Kevin's office to confront him about it. After jotting down Kevin's name, Stepp asked Diane one more question. Did Bob usually carry cash on him? Diane nodded. She said he always had a good amount of cash in his wallet, and he always carried his wallet in his back pocket, even when he was sitting at his desk. After speaking to Diane, Stepp and McCarrick returned to Bob's office, where forensics officers were still working. Bob's missing wallet meant that his murder could be the result of a robbery gone bad like they'd thought. And so they shared the information about Bob always carrying his wallet in his back pocket with the forensics team. After hearing this, one of the forensics officers walked over to Bob's body, crouched down, and studied the back pocket of his pants. She said she would cut away the pocket from the pants and keep it as a potential source for a DNA sample. Upon hearing this, Stepp and McCarrick looked confused. DNA samples could only be taken from bodily fluids, and unless they were missing something, it did not look like the pocket had any fluids on it. The forensics officer saw their looks and told them that this was sort of a long shot, but DNA testing technology was making huge advances very quickly. So maybe, down the line, they might be able to pull something useful from that back pocket, despite there not being any obvious fluids on it. Now, Stepp and McCarrick would love it if that wound up being the case, but there was obviously no way they could count on that. So, in the meantime, they decided to start with the one person Bob might have had a beef with, Kevin Green, the rival insurance salesman. Several hours after Bob's body had been discovered, Detective Stepp and Captain McCarrick walked into another small auto insurance office in St. Charles. And there, they found Kevin Green working at his desk. Kevin smiled warmly and then asked how he could help, almost like he might try to sell them something. But when they told him that Bob Eidman had been murdered, Kevin's smile quickly disappeared and he looked genuinely shocked. The investigators laid out their reason for being there. They knew that Kevin and Bob were rivals and that Bob had recently confronted him about stealing clients. But Kevin just shook his head and said it was not like that at all. He and Bob did not have a confrontation. They just spoke. And there was no rivalry. At least not how the detectives were making it sound. He said that he and Bob were competitors, but they were cordial with each other and actually seemed to get along just fine. Stepp asked Kevin if he could give them a timeline of how he'd spent his day. Kevin nodded and said he'd just gone shopping that morning at a sporting goods store, and then after that, he'd come into work. After taking down some notes, Stepp nodded and said they would be in touch if they needed anything else. Then the two investigators left. In the days immediately following the murder, Detective Stepp and Captain McCarrick got members of their team to begin to follow up on Kevin's alibi. As for the two of them, they began to focus on the theory that Bob's murder could be the result of a robbery gone bad. If that was the case, they knew they could be looking for anyone off the streets, but they hoped that the surveillance camera footage they had gotten from the Mexican restaurant would help make the search a whole lot easier. So, Stepp, McCarrick, and another member of their team began the painstaking process of sitting in a cramped office and watching the grainy video footage frame by frame. And after only doing this for a short time, everything on the screen began to look like a blur of black and white, and it was hard to even make things out clearly. But suddenly, as Stepp was staring at the monitor, he thought he saw something, and it was like he had just suddenly woken up. He told the officer they were working with to rewind the footage several minutes back. The officer did, and then all three of them leaned into the screen and watched. And this time, McCarrick and the other officer saw what Stepp had seen. The same car, a Ford Focus, drove slowly through the strip mall parking lot twice within the span of a few minutes on the day of the murder. It sort of looked like the driver was staking out the place. And the final time the car drove through the lot before disappearing from the footage was about 11 a.m. And that was right around the time the owner of the print shop had heard all that noise coming from Bob's office right above her, and just about 90 minutes before Bob's body had been discovered. Unfortunately, the car's license plates weren't visible on the footage, and so Stepp and McCarrick knew that that would make their jobs a whole lot harder. Still, they had a brand new lead here, and that was exciting. So they had members of their team compile a list of every registered Ford Focus in the county and told them to start tracking down each of the owners. They also set up roadblocks in St. Charles in the hope that the Ford Focus in question might end up at one. Stepp and McCarrick knew that finding this car from the footage could take a long time. After all, there were a lot of Ford Focuses to check, and there was no guarantee the one they wanted was registered in this county. So while the search for the Ford Focus got underway, the two investigators turned their attention back to the one suspect neither of them could get out of their minds: Bob's wife, Diane. During the week following the murder, Detective Stepp and Captain McCarrick began digging deeper into Bob's relationship with his wife. They knew that Diane's strange and sort of cold reaction to the news of her husband's death did not necessarily mean she was guilty, but they just couldn't shake the feeling that something had been off about her. So they reached out to Bob's cell phone carrier to secure his phone records, and they also started looking into Bob and Diane's finances. And it didn't take them long to discover that Diane had lied to them. Stepp and McCarrick learned that the couple was not doing well financially, like Diane had suggested. Starting and operating the insurance company had put Bob in significant debt. So much debt, in fact, that he had been in jeopardy of losing his business. But that wasn't even the biggest thing that jumped out at the investigators. They got more information on Bob's life insurance. The policy Diane had told them was worth just $5,000. And they learned that in fact Bob had 3 life insurance policies that collectively were worth a total of $400,000, and Diane would get all of it with Bob dead. On June 20th, so almost 2 weeks after the murder, Stepp and McCarrick sat across from Diane in an interview room at the St. Charles police station, and they did not waste any time skirting the issue. Stepp said they knew Diane had lied to them about her and Bob's financial situation. And perhaps even more importantly, they knew she had also lied about the amount of money she would receive from Bob's life insurance. Diane stayed calm and quiet, like she had when the investigators interviewed her the first time. She said she had lied about her and Bob's financial situation for one simple reason: she was embarrassed. This response actually didn't surprise Stepp and McCarrick. A lot of people do not feel comfortable talking about money problems, even to police conducting a very serious investigation. But Stepp didn't back off. He said Diane's response did not fully explain their issue, because it didn't explain why she'd lied about Bob's life insurance. What does that have to do with being embarrassed? But all Diane could say was she didn't realize the payout was as big as it was. Stepp and McCarrick did not quite buy it, and so they asked Diane to take a polygraph test. She agreed, and they set up the test that day, and the results came back inconclusive. Now, despite all the reasons the investigators now had to suspect Diane, they had no clear evidence actually tying her to her husband's murder. So they had to let her go. After 2 weeks of their investigation, Stepp and McCarrick believed they had several strong leads, but nothing concrete. The rival insurance agent's alibi had checked out. There was still a chance he could have hired someone to kill Bob, but it was an outside chance. On top of that, police had not gotten a hit on the Ford Focus from the surveillance footage, and they hadn't gotten anything from the DNA tests conducted on blood samples taken from the crime scene. But finally, as June came to an end, Stepp and McCarrick got a hold of Bob's detailed phone records. And those records immediately raised a red flag. Because there was one number that Bob called over and over again, and it wasn't Diane's. It was a Kansas City, Missouri number belonging to a man that neither investigators had heard of. His name was James Hall. And so Stepp contacted James and asked if he knew who Bob Eidman was. And James said yes, he knew Bob very well. In fact, the two of them had been lovers. In early July 2007, so almost a month after Bob's murder, Stepp and McCarrick made the 3.5-hour drive from St. Charles to Kansas City. Once they were there, they teamed up with some local police and then paid a visit to James at his house. James had known about Bob's murder soon after it happened, so he wasn't surprised the police wanted to talk to him. And James did not try to hide anything. He said that he and Bob had met online and had been having an affair for about 8 months. James even showed the police a bunch of love letters and gifts that Bob had given him. Initially, Stepp and McCarrick didn't find anything strange about this. But the more James talked, and the more personal items that he showed them, it started to look like he never threw away anything connected to Bob. And the investigators thought this went past the point of romance and into a possible obsession. Finally, McCarrick asked James if anything in their relationship had changed before Bob was killed. And James said yes. There had been a huge change, because Bob's wife, Diane, had recently discovered an email exchange between him and Bob, and so she'd learned about the affair. After that, Bob told James he would have to cool things off for a bit with them and focus instead on his marriage to Diane. As Detective Stepp and Captain McCarrick made the drive back to St. Charles, they began to realize that they now had a full-on love triangle to consider. There was a chance that James had gotten angry when Bob started to back away from their relationship, and maybe he lashed out and killed Bob. But Diane, who already had a clear financial motive, might have also gone into a rage and murdered Bob because he was cheating on her. Both of those theories made sense, but without any real evidence, Stepp and McCarrick felt like they were just stumbling around in the dark. By the late summer of 2007, Stepp and McCarrick were growing increasingly frustrated with the case. The investigation just kept going the same way it had from the beginning. They had several strong suspects and no concrete evidence. They continued to try to find the Ford Focus, along with some clue that might link Diane, James, or anyone else to the crime scene. But nothing turned up on either front. And as the months passed by, new leads stopped coming in. Other investigations demanded the cops' focus, and so Bob's case started to go cold. Fast forward to April of 2008, 10 months after Bob's murder. Detective Stepp was at his desk when a phone call got transferred to him. He picked up, and he heard the voice of a county forensics officer on the other end, and she sounded excited. As Stepp listened to her, a stunned look came across his face, because things like this just didn't usually happen in investigations. The forensics officer explained that the long shot the team had taken by cutting away Bob's back pocket from his pants had paid off, because now, almost a year later, the process known as touch DNA sampling had taken a massive leap forward. Essentially, in the past, usable DNA samples could only be obtained from bodily fluids. But now, new touch testing methods allowed the lab to obtain DNA samples from skin cells. And so the lab had tested Bob's back pocket, and they found that whoever had taken Bob's wallet out of that pocket had left their skin cells behind. So they now had a sample of that person's DNA. Detective Stepp hung up the phone, still in shock. This case that he'd basically given up on suddenly felt like it was about to be solved, and all because a forensics officer had seen what the future might bring and had saved a pants pocket. Stepp went to McCarrick's office and told the captain about this huge development. And right away, McCarrick got to work reassembling the investigative team. But even with this new DNA sample, it would still take the investigators some time to put everything together. But eventually, they would sit down face to face with the person who had left their skin cells behind at the crime scene. And at that point, Detective Stepp and Captain McCarrick knew who killed Bob Eidman. Based on the DNA sample, evidence found at the crime scene, and interviews conducted throughout the investigation, the following is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Bob Eidman on June 8, 2007. At 11 a.m. that day, the killer and their accomplice sat in a parked Ford Focus in the lot of the strip mall, just past Bob's office. They each held a gun, and they each had a bandana tied around their neck. At some point, the killer raised their bandana up over their nose to cover their face, and at that point, the accomplice did the same. Then the killer looked over at the accomplice, nodded, and then they both got out of the car and ran up the steps to the second floor of the strip mall. They quickly made it to Bob's office, opened up the door, stepped inside, and shut the door behind them. Bob, who was doing some work at his desk, looked up, but before he could say or do anything, the killer and the accomplice raised their guns, and the killer fired. The bullet grazed Bob on the chin, and he immediately began to scream and put his hand up to the wound, but the killer just moved closer to the desk and fired again. And this shot hit Bob on the neck. Blood poured from his wound as he fell out of his chair and hit the floor. The killer immediately ran around the desk and aimed right at Bob's face and fired the gun again, this time shooting Bob through the eye. Bob would die laying right there on the floor of his office. Once Bob was dead, the killer crouched down and took Bob's wallet out of his back pocket. Then the killer and the accomplice searched the office, looking for cash they knew Bob kept on hand. But they couldn't find anything, and then they heard shouting coming from right below them. And so in a panic, the killer just grabbed Bob's wallet, put it in his pocket, and then screamed at the accomplice that they needed to run. So the two of them fled the office, slamming the door behind them. They went down the steps, got back in the Ford Focus, and the killer hit the gas and they sped off down the street. And when they'd gotten miles away from the strip mall, the killer took Bob's wallet out of their pocket and looked inside of it. The killer took out the cash they saw and handed half of it to their accomplice. Bob Eidman's murderer was not a jealous wife, an obsessed lover, or a business rival. It turned out the investigators' first theory was right. Bob had been killed by someone who simply wanted to rob him. And that was a man named Paul White. But Paul was not a complete stranger to Bob, because Paul's wife was one of Bob's clients. And months before the murder, Paul had gone with his wife to Bob's office when she made a cash payment for her car insurance. So Paul knew Bob must keep cash on hand. On the night before the murder, Paul had lost $1,200 playing blackjack and craps at a casino, and so he was desperate for money. And his solution was he would kill Bob and take all his cash. After staying up all night, Paul got a hold of 2 guns. Then he got his friend, a man named Cleo Hines, to come with him to provide extra muscle. And then the two of them went to Bob's office and killed him and then robbed him. However, they didn't find the cash in Paul's desk drawer, and so they ended up committing this cold-blooded murder just for the money they found in Bob's wallet, which was $300, or after splitting it, $150 each. And they took that money right back to the casino and quickly lost all of it. The investigators had been on the trail of that Ford Focus, which would turn out to belong to Paul's accomplice, Cleo. But after almost a year of searching, they still hadn't tracked it down. But when the crime lab conducted their DNA touch testing on the skin cells they pulled from Bob's pocket, those samples eventually led them to Paul, who happened to be in prison at the time for committing forgery. Investigators were quickly able to connect Paul to his accomplice Cleo and to the Ford Focus they'd seen on the surveillance footage. Bob's wife Diane, who had nothing to do with the crime, would break down in tears during Paul and Cleo's trial. Paul and Cleo were both convicted, and each of them were sentenced to 2 life terms in prison, with no possibility of parole. On a hot day in July of 2011, Dr. Barbara Elliott stood on a lakeside dock in Minnesota behind 3 of her 4 teenage daughters. The girls were all looking out over the water where their 4th sister, 13-year-old Emma, was learning how to water ski. Their father, William, was driving the motorboat, and behind it was Emma, getting pulled right along. At some point, Emma stood up on her skis, but only long enough to hit a big wave and go tumbling down beneath the surface again. But all the sisters cheered when their dad circled back around, and Emma motioned from the water that she wanted to try again. And this time, once the boat started going, Emma was able to stay upright a lot longer, and her older sisters went crazy, jumping and clapping as Emma sailed across the water. Emma's mother, Barbara, beamed with pride, and not just because Emma had learned to water ski in just a single afternoon, but because she was just very proud of Emma's determination. Emma had Down syndrome, which meant that she was born with an extra copy of chromosome 21. The extra chromosome affected the way her brain developed, so she was growing up with some mental and physical challenges. And so Barbara, who was a developmental pediatrician, knew full well how much harder learning how to water ski would be for Emma than it would be for her sisters. But Barbara realized very early on that she should never doubt Emma. Emma had always been outgoing and athletic. She loved soccer and swim practice. She took ice skating lessons and karate classes. She was also a social butterfly and was looking forward to starting middle school in the fall. Basically, whenever Emma set her mind to something, she always thrived. Emma skied for a few more seconds before losing her grip on the tow rope and splashing back into the water. But a second later, Emma came back up for air and gave her family a big thumbs up. Barbara could see Emma's big smile all the way from the dock. 5 months later, in December, Barbara meandered her way through a Christmas tree farm, enjoying the smell of freshly cut pine trees. Her daughters were up ahead, choosing which Christmas tree they should strap to the roof of the car and bring home. William was next to them, setting up his camera on a tripod. This had become a sort of annual tradition in their family. They would come to this farm to pick out their tree and take a family Christmas photo. In the past, the way this typically went is Emma would run all around the farm until she found the perfect tree, at which point she would loudly announce it to the rest of her family, and then that would be the tree they would choose. But this year, Emma seemed checked out from the whole process. She kept staring off into space while her sisters tried to get her attention. Her oldest sister, Mallory, kept asking her questions, but Emma just ignored her. And then when she finally answered, her words were slow and labored, like she was talking with peanut butter in her mouth. Barbara wondered if this was just typical teenager stuff. Emma was 13 after all. Her personality was bound to change a little bit. But Barbara still couldn't help but feel worried about her youngest daughter. She wondered if maybe something was going on at school that had her mind occupied. William finally got the camera all set up and then told the girls to smile for a photo. But Emma just stared at the ground. Barbara called Emma and told her to look up, and she did, but by the time the camera flashed, Emma was staring back at the ground again, lost in her own world. William had to take the picture 3 more times just to get a shot with Emma looking at the camera. And even then, she wasn't smiling. One morning, a few weeks later, Barbara was in the kitchen pouring herself a bowl of cereal. The rest of her family was already eating around the table. Well, all of them were eating except for Emma, who was just slumped over in her chair, picking at her food and staring at the half-melted Christmas candles in the center of the table. She'd been quiet all morning, even though Mallory had been asking her questions, like whether she was excited to return to school and see her friends again. And so eventually, Mallory just began asking Emma really basic questions that, frankly, she didn't care about the answers at all, like what day of the week is it and what time is it? But Emma didn't even look up. At this point, Barbara exchanged a worried glance with her husband William and also her other daughters. Emma had been withdrawn like this for all of winter break. She avoided eye contact and barely spoke to any of them, She hadn't helped them decorate the Christmas tree, and she got moody whenever anybody asked her questions. And even stranger, Emma hadn't wanted to see any of her friends over break. But as Barbara thought back even farther, like over the whole last few months, she realized Emma had been through a very difficult time. Emma had just started middle school, and she was immediately taken out of general education and put in special education classes for the first time in her life, which could have felt like a demoralizing setback. Maybe she was so upset about what was going on at school that was having a profound impact on her life. She wasn't sleeping very well, perhaps because she was thinking about this stuff, and perhaps the lack of sleep was making her irritable and not really interested in talking to anyone. But trouble at school didn't really explain why Emma now was just completely ignoring her sister. Barbara knew Emma would never give Mallory the cold shoulder for no reason. This behavior was radically out of character. Emma adored her big sister. Barbara had worked in pediatric medicine long enough to know that whatever was going on with Emma was not normal, and so she would have to see her doctor. When Barbara and Emma went in to see her pediatrician, he immediately ordered a full medical workup for Emma. He ran all sorts of tests, like an EEG, which measures electrical activity in the brain, also a sleep study, a vision and hearing screen, and full blood work. But none of these tests showed anything wrong with Emma. But just to make sure they covered all their bases, the pediatrician also ordered an MRI of Emma's brain, which creates a detailed scan of the body using magnetic waves. And the MRI did show a few small abnormalities in her brain, but nothing that would explain the apathy, lack of focus, and intellectual decline Emma seemed to be experiencing. And so after that, the pediatrician said he had no further tests to recommend. Whatever was going on with Emma, it didn't seem like a problem he could fix. Several weeks later, after the winter break was over, Barbara was upstairs helping clean Emma's room. Emma used to clean it herself, but she wasn't doing her chores anymore. On top of Emma's increasing social isolation, she'd also begun having these frequent crying episodes. But just as the tears would dry up, she'd burst into fits of laughter. And also, Emma had become hypersensitive to noise and touch. She wouldn't even let her mom brush her hair. She barely slept at all, which Barbara knew was taking a further toll on her mood and energy levels. Her daughter seemed like a shell of her former self. It was emotionally very painful for Barbara to clean Emma's room these days, dusting the trophies and mementos that lined her shelves. They were all reminders of who Emma used to be, a girl who was thriving. Once Barbara was finished dusting, she picked up Emma's backpack, which was overturned on the floor. And as she lifted it up, a small bundle of papers fell out. She was about to set the papers on Emma's desk when she realized the papers were actually letters written by Emma to her favorite teachers. Now, Barbara would never invade her children's privacy if she could help it, but given everything going on with Emma, she gave herself permission to dive into these notes. They were all about Emma's struggles in school. Some of the students in her new special education classes were too aggressive, she wrote. They would throw fits and shout, and this really upset her. But the teachers yelled at her too, which upset her even more. She didn't like school anymore, and she just wanted to go back to 5th grade. Barbara noticed that all these letters were written back in September and October, about 6 months ago, right around the time that Emma first became lethargic and reclusive. Barbara realized that Emma had known all those months ago that something was wrong. She'd written these letters basically asking her teachers for help, but for whatever reason, it appeared like she was either too shy or too overwhelmed to actually deliver them. Reading her daughter's notes was heartbreaking for Barbara, but it was also fairly informative. She began to wonder if maybe she was wrong to think that her daughter's struggles were a medical issue. If Emma was having this much trouble adjusting to her new school, maybe her condition was actually psychological. Several months later, in the summer of 2012, Barbara sat at the dinner table watching Emma eat. Emma was bent over her plate, shoveling food into her mouth, and swallowing it so quickly she barely had time to chew. Emma had been an eating machine over the past few months, but tonight she was really gorging herself. Even though Barbara was a pediatrician herself, she could not explain why her daughter's behavior had changed this much. After Barbara had found Emma's letters, she and her husband had taken Emma to every therapist and psychiatrist they could find. And one psychiatrist who specialized in children with disabilities diagnosed Emma with post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, due to the difficult transition from elementary school to middle school. She'd prescribed Emma antidepressants, and at first, they appeared to work. But then she complained that the medication made her feel dizzy, and so they stopped it. And unfortunately, the next medication they tried made her insomnia worse, and the next one after that gave her stomach pain. The only drug that Emma could tolerate was memantine, a medication used to treat memory loss in dementia patients. And in reality, it only helped a little bit. Nothing was able to bring Emma back to her old self. Barbara was frustrated that after consulting with so many doctors and therapists, that no one could find a treatment that worked for Emma, or could even diagnose exactly what was wrong. She was beginning to realize that if she and her family were going to get Emma back, she was going to have to find answers herself. Almost a year later, in 2013, Barbara stood in front of a big lecture hall, clicking through slides on a projector. She was a speaker at a conference of Down syndrome researchers, and she was presenting her daughter's case to the community. She fought to keep a neutral face when she played videos of her daughter water skiing and enjoying time with her friends and family, the way she'd been just a few years ago. But as painful as that was, Barbara pressed on, explaining all the details of Emma's startling regression. And as she presented her daughter's case, she couldn't help but notice a few audience members wiping tears from their eyes. A couple days later, Barbara received an email from a woman who had seen her presentation. The woman's name was Lucy Duncan, and like Barbara, Lucy was searching for answers. When Lucy's daughter Sierra was 20 years old, she went through a very similar regression to Emma. Lucy had tried many treatments for her daughter, but all of them were unsuccessful. Lucy had found a medical researcher who'd taken some interest in Sierra's case, but so far nothing had come from that either. Barbara thought Lucy sounded just like her. They were both mothers desperate to bring their daughters back. But also, as Barbara read this email, something else clicked. There were other people out there with Down syndrome who were also suffering from this mysterious, steady decline. And so Barbara wrote back to Lucy and promised they would stay in touch. They'd compare notes in the coming months and hopefully figure out what was causing their daughters to regress. Or, better yet, find a treatment plan that actually helped their kids. More than a year later, Barbara was sitting inside of a doctor's office, watching as a nurse used what looked like 2 robot arms to touch Emma's head. These arms were giant magnets that stimulate nerve cells in the brain to try to relieve symptoms of major depression. Recently, Barbara had taken Emma to a new psychiatrist who diagnosed her with catatonia, a disorder that interrupts normal brain function. People with catatonia struggle to communicate and lose their motor skills. This psychiatrist had recommended a 4-week course of this cranial nerve stimulation in hopes it would improve Emma's mood and help her engage with her friends and family again. Thankfully, this sort of bizarre treatment did not seem to bother Emma, who was now 16 years old. She was watching Taylor Swift videos on her phone, seemingly unaware that the nurse was pulling a strap across her head and getting ready to turn on these robot arms. The nurse flipped on the machine, and a metallic clicking sound filled the room. Barbara winced, but Emma seemed absolutely fine. So Barbara stopped worrying and leaned back in her chair. On the way home, Barbara didn't notice much of a change in Emma. But one night, after a few weeks of treatment, Barbara went upstairs to get ready for bed. She passed Emma's room, expecting to see the desk lamp on and Emma sitting at her desk watching YouTube, but instead, the room was dark. Curious, Barbara poked her head in, and to her shock, Emma was in bed, sound asleep, not staring at the ceiling, racked with insomnia, not pacing or zoning out or acting moody, just peacefully sleeping. Barbara felt an overwhelming sense of joy. Now, Emma might not be able to communicate with the outside world just yet, but Barbara hoped this was a sign that maybe she was feeling more peaceful inside. It was a small glimpse of who Emma used to be, and Barbara hoped that it meant the nerve stimulation treatments were working, and that the old Emma was on her way back. Two years later, in 2016, Barbara sat down in the living room and opened up her laptop. Emma was 18 years old now, and they were still searching for a comprehensive treatment plan. Nerve stimulation had helped Emma, but she was by no means back to her normal self. She was still very withdrawn anytime they were out in public, and she suffered from severe obsessive-compulsive disorder. Obsessive-compulsive disorder, or OCD, is a condition where people have unwanted thoughts and feel the need to do certain actions to ease their anxiety about them. They can interfere with their daily life. But, as always, her mom, Barbara, had a plan. A few days earlier, Barbara had spoken with Lucy, the woman who contacted her after her presentation at the Down syndrome conference. Lucy's daughter, Sierra, was also still struggling, and so they wanted to see if there were any other parents of Down syndrome children out there who had watched their kids regress and their personalities disappear. So they had started a Facebook support group. And now, Barbara clicked on that group's page, and she was immediately overwhelmed. It had been up for only a few days, but already dozens of parents had joined, posting stories of their once thriving children. And each post had a similar ending. Their kids suddenly regressed and became a shell of who they used to be without any explanation. Barbara couldn't believe how many stories like hers were pouring in. She called Lucy, and the two of them stayed on the phone, scrolling through the messages together. Parents asking for help, swapping tips and treatments, and sharing information about physicians who managed to help their kids in some way. Barbara loved the feeling of not being alone as she read through these posts. But she also realized something. Everyone seemed to have tips for mild improvement, but nobody had met any physician who had actually cracked the code and figured out what actually caused this regression in the first place. And so all these Facebook posts forced Barbara to confront a potentially heartbreaking reality. None of these kids and young adults were getting any better. It seemed like Emma's future was going to be about just adjusting to this new normal, not about regaining what she had lost. But Barbara could not accept that. Several years later, in April of 2020, a pediatrician named Dr. Christopher DeSantis sat in his Los Angeles office. Dr. DeSantis was the director of neuroimmunology at one of the largest pediatric medical centers in the country. And on this day, he was looking over the results of a spinal tap, a test he had run on one of his patients, a teenager with Down syndrome named Jackson. 1 year earlier, Jackson had become quiet and insular and basically stopped interacting with the world around him. And so Dr. DeSantis was trying his best to figure out what was wrong with Jackson. But this was proving to be very difficult to do because it was the COVID pandemic, and basically the whole world was shut down. The hospital required so much protective equipment and social distancing measures that it was very hard to schedule in-person appointments at all, let alone order lab work or other procedures to figure out what was going on. At least here, alone in his office, Dr. DeSantis could just focus on his patients and retain some feeling of normalcy. As he looked over the spinal tap test results, he realized there could be hope that he was close to figuring out the cause behind Jackson's change in behavior. The results suggested that there was inflammation in Jackson's brain, which is usually caused by some type of infection. But it can also happen when the patient's own immune system mistakenly attacks healthy tissue that it thinks is an infection, which is known as an autoimmune disorder. And people with Down syndrome have a much higher rate of common autoimmune disorders, such as thyroid disorders, celiac disease, and skin conditions. So, to Dr. DeSantis, it actually made perfect sense that maybe Jackson's regression could be caused by an autoimmune disorder. The doctor wondered if there was a way to reset Jackson's immune system so that the inflammation in his brain might decrease. And so he decided to try a standard treatment for immune disorders called intravenous immune globulin, which gradually purifies the immune system. If it worked, Jackson just might be able to reconnect with the world around him, instead of living inside of this isolating fog. 2 weeks later, Dr. DeSantis was back in his office catching up on work when he heard a commotion in the hallway. A mix of cheering and applause and stamping feet. Confused, he opened his door to see what was going on, and immediately felt a pair of arms wrap around his waist. He looked down to see his patient, Jackson, locking him in a bear hug. Then Jackson pulled back, smiling and laughing and telling him he felt better. Dr. DeSantis couldn't believe it. This was a completely different kid from the near catatonic teenager that checked into the hospital a month ago. The immune globulin treatment, in combination with a few other treatments, had brought Jackson back to life, so to speak. In fact, it was so successful that right away, Dr. DeSantis wondered if maybe other patients with Down syndrome could benefit from this treatment. And sure enough, a few months later, when Dr. DeSantis was surfing Facebook, he stumbled upon a support group for families with Down syndrome children who had regressed. Dr. DeSantis immediately reached out to the group and asked if he could post about his own research. Lucy Duncan was excited and told Dr. DeSantis to please post it. By this point, the Facebook group that she had set up with Barbara had hundreds of members who were eager for more and new information. And so the moment Dr. DeSantis began posting about his experimental treatment that had presumably cured his patient, Jackson, responses on this page poured in. Not long after that, Lucy flew with her daughter, Sierra, out to Los Angeles to meet with Dr. DeSantis. He administered the same course of treatment for Sierra as he had for Jackson, and right away, Sierra did show signs of improvement. But then her progress just stopped. She didn't have the same dramatic turnaround that Jackson experienced. Dr. DeSantis suggested that maybe because Sierra had been in regression much longer than Jackson, that was why the treatment was not as effective. Lucy was bitterly disappointed, but then she remembered another researcher who had once taken an interest in Sierra's case. His name was Dr. Antonio Rivera. Now, he didn't have any answers at the time for what was going on with her daughter, but he had told her that he was going to continue his research. Lucy thought that maybe Dr. Rivera should know about Dr. DeSantis' research. So she pulled out her phone and sent an email to both doctors, introducing them. She hoped that, just maybe, they might find a way to help patients like her daughter and the hundreds of other people on their Facebook group, whose children had been in regression for 5 or even 10 years. Following Lucy's introduction, Dr. DeSantis reached out to Dr. Rivera, and he was delighted to learn that Dr. Rivera had continued his Down syndrome research. Dr. Rivera suspected that this regression was caused by the extra chromosome 21 that people with Down syndrome are born with. He believed the extra chromosome caused them to generate an overly powerful immune system that can sometimes turn on the body itself, making people sick instead of protecting them from disease. This would explain the inflammation Dr. DeSantis had discovered in the brain of his other patient, Jackson. Dr. Rivera suspected that medical researchers had not noticed this autoimmune disorder until now, at least in part because of the history of bias in the medical field about people with Down syndrome. And Dr. DeSantis agreed. If a typical teenager suddenly became a lethargic and moody loner, their doctors would treat it like a major issue. But Drs. DeSantis and Rivera both suspected that doctors generally paid less attention to antisocial behavior in people with Down syndrome because they already had an intellectual disability. Dr. DeSantis was thrilled to meet a doctor whose research aligned so closely with his own. The two of them decided to work together to bring attention and resources to this autoimmune disease. In 2022, Dr. DeSantis took the lead on a paper that named the condition Down syndrome regression disorder. In the paper, he explained that it affects between 1 and 5% of those with Down syndrome. In June of 2023, Emma finally received an official diagnosis after 12 years of regressing. In October of that year, she began immune globulin treatment. At that point, Emma was 25 years old, and her recovery was not as dramatic as some of Dr. DeSantis' younger patients. But the treatment still did make a significant improvement in her quality of life. She was now able to at least smile and joke around again. Recently, Emma graduated from a local university transition program for people with disabilities. She's making friends again, performing in community theater, and water skiing, something she hadn't been able to do for 10 years.
At the end of December in 1984, in a little village in northern India, a young woman named Sumitra had her first child with her husband. And right away, Sumitra fell in love with her little baby boy. She had always wanted a baby, and now that she had one, she carried him with her everywhere, strapped to her chest. And any time she had a free hand from cooking or housework, she would use it to pat his head or tickle his feet. Life was not easy for anyone in Sumitra's village, which was located just south of the Himalayan mountains along the Ganges River. Sumitra's village was very poor. People lived in mud huts with thatched roofs. They had no electricity, and basically no one had any formal education. As for Sumitra, her life was especially challenging even relative to her peers, because when she was very young, her mother died, and then her father had to go away all the time for work, and so she was left alone a lot and basically was raised by a cousin. And now, even though she was married, her husband also had to travel quite a bit for work. And so Sumitra, she lived with her husband's parents in their hut, but the reality is she wasn't nearly as close with them as she was with her own family, and her own family was nowhere nearby, and so Sumitra's life was really quite lonely even as an adult. And so when Sumitra had her baby, it was like for the first time in her life, she didn't feel alone, and she was excited about her life. She was happy that something was finally going the way she wanted it to. But then, one day in early 1985, everything changed. That day, Sumitra, with her son attached to her chest, was walking into town to get water from the well. And as she was walking along the dirt path, she suddenly came to a stop, very rigid, and she dropped her bucket on the ground. A couple of other villagers who were nearby heard the bucket fall. They turned and looked at Sumitra, who was standing there totally rigid. And so one of these villagers, who was very concerned, walked over to Sumitra and asked her what was going on. But Sumitra, she didn't say anything. She just stood there frozen. And this concerned villager looked down at Sumitra's hands, and her fingers were bending back so hard it almost looked like they might break going in the other direction. And then this villager, before asking any more questions, looked up at Sumitra's face, and her eyes had rolled back into the back of her skull, and she had begun grinding her teeth so hard that it was making this loud cracking sound with every movement of her jaw side to side. And so this villager was totally terrified and backed up for a second, and right as they did, Sumitra's baby, who was still strapped to Sumitra's chest, began hysterically crying. And so the combination of Sumitra's baby crying and these other couple of villagers who were staring at Sumitra, who's standing there in this very grotesque pose, attracted the eyes of other nearby villagers, and soon there was a crowd of people just standing there looking at Sumitra, not sure what to do. And then, just as suddenly as Sumitra had fallen into this trance, it stopped, and Sumitra, she kind of shook her head, she fluttered her eyes, and she looked around, and then suddenly became aware that her son is hysterically crying, and also there's this crowd of people all around her. She has no idea why, and so feeling really embarrassed, but again, not knowing what's going on, Sumitra quickly picked up her water bucket, she held her son and hustled out of the crowd of people and made her way into town where she would get water. When Sumitra came back from the well and was back near her hut, she didn't tell anyone about what had happened on the way to the well. Frankly, she couldn't really remember what happened. And so Sumitra told herself that whatever happened on the trail to the well, that trance she fell into, it had to be a one-time thing, likely brought on by stress and sleeplessness from having a new baby. But a few weeks later, it happened again, and this time the trance lasted quite a bit longer. Sumitra's father-in-law had walked into their kitchen and found Sumitra standing there totally rigid with her hands kind of bending backwards and her eyes rolled back in her skull, and he would tell her later on that he had shaken her and tried to wake her up, but he couldn't for almost 10 minutes, and then when she had snapped out of it, she had no memory and had no idea what happened. By May of 1985, so roughly 5 months after her first trance, Sumitra was falling into these bizarre spells nearly every day, and they were lasting hours at a time. And even more bizarre, lately, during Sumitra's trances, she would begin to speak, and the things she said were totally strange. Typically, she would bark out cries for help. She would say her head was being crushed and someone needed to help her. And then suddenly her voice would drop down to a whisper, and she would say, "All I can see is darkness." Sumitra's family would contact the local medicine man who would come out and examine Sumitra, but he couldn't figure out what was wrong with her. Besides her trances, there seemed to be absolutely nothing wrong with her. She was the picture of good health. And then on July 16th, 1985, so roughly 6 months into these trances, Sumitra would fall into another trance while she was cooking, and during this trance, she would speak. Except when she spoke, she was very calm, and she just said, "In 3 days, I'm going to die." By this point, Sumitra was terrified of whatever was happening to her, and she was totally exhausted, and so was her family. Sumitra had stopped caring for her son, who was now about 8 months old, because she was afraid that at any moment she could fall into a trance and accidentally hurt him. And so her mother-in-law had basically become the boy's mother, and also Sumitra's husband, who was the primary breadwinner for the family, was forced to stop traveling for work and just stay home and help out with Sumitra and his son. Finally, on July 19th, 1985, so this was the day that in her trance, Sumitra had predicted she would die. On that day, Sumitra woke up and made a very conscious effort not to do anything that could potentially harm her. She didn't cook because she didn't want to be near flames. She didn't walk near anything with any sort of ledge she could fall off. She didn't even walk downstairs for the same reason. She also kept a very safe distance from her son in order to make sure he was safe. And by late afternoon that day, Sumitra was just fine, and there was no sign that anything bad was going to happen to her, and so she and her family began to relax. As Sumitra's mother-in-law began making dinner, Sumitra decided to go outside and get some fresh air. And when she got out there, she saw one of her close friends across the road, and so she waved to her, and as her friend cheerfully began walking closer to Sumitra to say hello, Sumitra suddenly froze, her eyes went back in her skull, her hands became rigid, and she fell into one of her trances. And so this friend, like everyone else in the village, had become quite accustomed to seeing Sumitra in these trances, and so really, the friend was not that concerned when she saw Sumitra doing this, but then Sumitra began doing something in her trance that this friend had never seen before. Sumitra, who normally had her hands by her side during these trances, she began raising her hands up till they reached her forehead, and then wildly Sumitra began clawing at something right above her head, and as she did, her breathing became very loud and labored, and so this friend, feeling suddenly so concerned for Sumitra, rushed over, but when she got right next to Sumitra, there was nothing she could do. Sumitra was just clawing at the sky, breathing really heavily, and then suddenly Sumitra stopped, and she put her hands down by her side, and she went back to this rigid pose, and then out of Sumitra's mouth came this horrible, low, rattling moan sound. It was just a constant sound that came out of her, and it got deeper and deeper and deeper until Sumitra's voice kind of cracked, and then suddenly Sumitra went totally still. And when this happened, Sumitra's friend, who was right next to her, realized Sumitra, even though she was standing upright, she was not breathing at all. It was like she was a statue. And so this friend began screaming for help. And so Sumitra's in-laws and her husband and other villagers who heard this cry, they came running outside and they quickly circled around Sumitra. And then a few minutes later, the medicine man arrived. He broke through the circle, went right up to Sumitra and began checking her out. He checked her pulse. He checked her heartbeat. He kind of looked inside of her mouth. He looked in her eyes. And then after a minute, he stepped back and he just said, "She's dead." Sumitra's husband fell to his knees, and Sumitra's mother-in-law, who was carrying Sumitra's son, began crying. All the while, Sumitra's body still remained totally upright and rigid in the middle of all these people, with her hands tight by her side and her eyes rolled back, and her face frozen in what looked like a silent scream. Eventually, the medicine man and Sumitra's father-in-law stepped forward and lowered Sumitra's frozen, rigid body onto the ground on her back, and they closed her eyes. There was no hospital to take Sumitra's body to or official to call about her death. And in this village at this time, it was very important for both religious and public health reasons to take care of the body very quickly. And what that looked like was the villagers would work together to perform the Hindu death rituals, and then afterwards they would cremate the body, which is a process of burning the body until all you have left is the ashes. And so as Sumitra's body lay still rigid on her back right near her home, her family and the villagers began making preparations for her funeral. Sumitra's mother-in-law and some women from the village began scrubbing down Sumitra's body, as well as putting essential oils on her face, and other villagers who were not a part of that went off to find wood for a fire. The villagers weren't talking much, and a lot of the women were crying, but it wasn't just grief they were feeling, it was also fear. They all knew about Sumitra's trances. They happened all the time for months. But what the villagers couldn't wrap their heads around was the idea that during one of these trances, Sumitra had accurately predicted her own death. And so now the villagers couldn't help but think that dark forces were at play here, that maybe Sumitra was possessed, and now whatever had possessed her and killed her is somewhere in the village. And so that night, as the sun started to go down, normally kids would be out playing in the village, but their parents said, no, come inside, it's not safe outside. And so for the most part, the only people who were outside that night were the women who were still cleaning and prepping Sumitra's body for her funeral. And at some point, one of the women who was doing this was brushing out Sumitra's hair. And as she did that, she suddenly stopped and she backed up and screamed and pointed at Sumitra. And then the other women all around Sumitra's body, they looked over at what this person was pointing at, and they too saw it and screamed, and everyone began scrambling to try to get away from Sumitra as fast as possible. What all these terrified women were seeing was that Sumitra, her eyes were closed, but her eyes were darting left and right, so her eyelids were kind of fluttering. And then suddenly Sumitra's chest filled with air, and then she breathed out a long, loud exhale, and then she opened her eyes and she sat bolt upright and began looking around. And the other women who were terrified, they're looking at her and they were struck by how completely healthy and normal Sumitra now looked, even though for the past 45 minutes, she didn't have a heartbeat and was totally pale and looked completely dead. Sumitra wiped the essential oils from her face, and then she stood up, and as she did, the medicine man, he had heard all the commotion and ran over, and he ran to Sumitra and kind of assisted her and got her to stand on her feet because she was a little bit wobbly. And then the medicine man performed a checkup on Sumitra, checking her heartbeat, her pulse, he looked in her mouth, he looked at her eyes, and then he asked Sumitra, how are you feeling? And Sumitra said, I'm okay. And then the medicine man, he kind of turned to face this now huge crowd of onlooking villagers, and the medicine man had a big smile on his face, and he said, you all have just witnessed a miracle. Sumitra is back from the dead. Sumitra's husband and her in-laws were too shocked to say anything or really even react. But then suddenly, Sumitra's husband was overcome with joy, and he ran forward to hug Sumitra. But as Sumitra turned and saw him coming towards her, she backed up suddenly and put her hands out to protect herself from her husband. And immediately, the medicine man, he kind of stepped in between the husband and Sumitra, and he patted the husband on the shoulder and said, she's been through something very traumatic. You need to give her time and space to recover. And everybody in the village who saw this happen, they were accustomed to whenever Sumitra fell into one of her trances, when she came out of them, she oftentimes was a little bit confused. And so they all just kind of assumed that this is what was happening, but on a bigger scale. This is a really intense trance they've seen, but she's just confused. She'll be okay soon. And so the villagers dispersed, and the medicine man assisted Sumitra back into her hut, and he got her in her bed where she fell asleep. And then afterwards, the medicine man reassured Sumitra's husband and her in-laws that Sumitra, when she woke up, she'd likely be just fine, but he would come by and he would do another thorough medical exam on her just to make sure. And the next morning, when Sumitra woke up, she did seem a lot better. When she left her bedroom, she seemed far less confused than she had been the night before. But as soon as Sumitra saw her husband and her in-laws, she got so scared she just bolted from her hut and started running away. And so the medicine man who had just come by to do his thorough checkup, he saw her take off, and so he began chasing her, as well as Sumitra's husband and father-in-law. They took off after Sumitra. And finally, when Sumitra's husband caught up to Sumitra, he grabbed her by the arm to stop her, and Sumitra ripped her arm away from him, and she said, "How dare you touch another man's wife?" And as the husband kind of ushered Sumitra back towards their house, she continued to say, "You're not my family. This is not my home." And then finally, Sumitra's husband and the medicine man had to literally drag Sumitra to get her to go back inside the hut. And as they dragged her inside, she kept screaming that her name was Shiva Duetti and her in-laws had killed her. Over the next couple of days, the medicine man and Sumitra's family tried everything they could to try to snap her out of what seemed like a really long trance, but nothing they did worked. It seemed like Sumitra had just kind of lost her mind. Sumitra began refusing to touch her beloved son, and instead would demand that someone bring her Rinku and Tinku, but when no one knew who or what she was talking about, Sumitra would just get furious. Sumitra had never gone to school, and so did did not know how to write. But now, suddenly, in this new trance that she was in, Sumitra would go inside of her bedroom and write these long, totally unhinged sounding letters to total strangers, asking them to come, please take her home. And when she wasn't doing that, she was typically outside in the courtyard looking at a scar on her foot, wondering how she got it. Sumitra also began wrapping her sari, which is a type of dress fabric, in a new and strange way around her head. She also refused to eat off of any dishes that her family had previously used, and her voice began to sound different. It was higher pitched and much faster, and the way she spoke was always so rude. And so eventually, Sumitra's husband and her in-laws and everybody in the village just kind of resigned themselves to the fact that when Sumitra had not had a heartbeat for 45 minutes when she died, during that time, she likely suffered serious brain damage, or at a minimum, when she kind of came back from the dead, she suffered some kind of psychological break. And so that was why she was acting the way she was. And soon, people just stopped trying to break Sumitra out of this trance she was in, and instead, they all focused on just trying to keep her from running away or hurting herself. And then one day, on October 20th, 1985, so 3 months after Sumitra had died for 45 minutes, Sumitra's family heard a knock on their front door. When Sumitra's husband went to the door and opened it up, he saw there was this older gentleman standing there wearing a suit and nice shoes, standing several feet back from the door, as if he was kind of shy but felt compelled to knock on the door. Now, right off the bat, this man looked totally out of place to Sumitra's husband. Nobody in this village wore suits or nice shoes. In fact, most people, including Sumitra and her family, didn't even wear shoes. But even stranger than what this man was wearing was what he was clutching against his chest. He had this huge leather-bound book with gold trim around the edges that he was holding onto very tightly as if it was very important. And so finally, this strange man, who was visibly nervous and rocking back and forth, began to speak. But his voice was so low, Sumitra's husband had to lean forward just to hear him. The man said his name was Ram Tripathi, and he wanted to know if there was a young woman living in this home who had recently begun acting differently. Sumitra's husband had no idea who Ram Tripathi was. He didn't know this guy. He certainly didn't know where he came from. But what was going through his head was, how is this stranger who's dressed in a funny way, who's got this weird book, how is he aware of the issues my wife is having? And so after a long pause, Sumitra's husband just kind of looks Ram Tripathi up and down a couple of times and then says, "Wait right here. I'll be right back." And then Sumitra's husband turned around. He walked through the hut into Sumitra's bedroom, and kind of matter-of-factly, he said to Sumitra, who was sitting there writing another letter, that there's a strange man outside named Ram Tripathi, and he's asking about you. Sumitra's husband expected Sumitra to just turn and look at him with a blank stare, like she had been doing the last few days. But this time she turned and looked up at him with a huge smile on her face, and then she leapt up and ran to the front door and leapt into the arms of Ram Tripathi. And Ram Tripathi, he was kind of taken aback, still holding his book, not really reacting to what Sumitra was doing. And at some point, Sumitra leans in and whispers something into Ram Tripathi's ear, and Ram Tripathi, he reacted to it very negatively. He kind of looked up at her and looked over at Sumitra's husband like something was wrong, but Sumitra's husband couldn't tell what Sumitra had said, and so the whole situation made no sense to Sumitra's husband, and apparently it also made no sense to Ram Tripathi. And so pretty quickly, Ram Tripathi kind of pushed Sumitra off of him and took a few steps back and looked at Sumitra and said, "What's your name?" And Sumitra is now looking at Ram Tripathi with a look of anger and betrayal on her face, and she says, "My name is Shiva Dwivedi." Ram Tripathi, after hearing this, did not respond, and instead just kind of gestured over to a low wall just outside of their house for he and Sumitra to go sit down on. And so he walked over, and Sumitra followed him. They sat down, and Sumitra's husband, he walked over, but he stayed a couple of feet back standing up. And once Ram Tripathi was sitting down, he lowered his big leather-bound book and he opened it up, and inside were all these photographs. And right away, Ram Tripathi pointed at one of the pictures, which contained a bunch of people in it, and he turned to Sumitra and he said, "Can you identify who's in this photo?" And Sumitra, she looked at the photo and immediately began rattling off names that were all correct. These are people that Sumitra's husband, he's looked over and he's got no idea who the people are in that photo. And so after Sumitra correctly identifies that photo, Ram Tripathi turns the page, he picks out another photo, and he says, can you identify who's in this photo? And again, Sumitra, one by one, would name correctly all the people in the photo. And then finally, Ram Tripathi took a sigh, and he flipped the page one more time, and he pointed to one particular picture which contained one person. And he looked at Sumitra, and he said, do you know who this is? And Sumitra, she would look over at the photo, and instead of immediately saying the name, she paused, and she kind of began to breathe heavy, and she seemed kind of angry, and then she looked at Ram Tripathi, and she said, I know who that is. That's my sister-in-law, and she killed me by hitting me over the head with a brick. And at this, Ram Tripathi dropped his book on the ground, and he turned and embraced Sumitra as hard and as intensely as she had when she had run out and leapt into his arms. And he and Sumitra, they hugged and cried for a long time. And then finally, when they separated, Ram Tripathi turned to Sumitra's husband, who's still just standing there totally bewildered, and he tells him, let's go inside and I'll explain everything. Once Ram Tripathi was inside with Sumitra and her family, he told them an unbelievable story about a woman named Shiva Dwivedi. Shiva Dwivedi was, of course, the name that Sumitra for months had been saying was her own. But over those few months, her family had just assumed that that name meant nothing and that what she was saying was nonsense because of her brain injury. But Ram Tripathi would tell them that Shiva Dwivedi was the name of a young woman who lived in a city none of them had ever heard before, located about 60 miles away from their village. He would tell them that Shiva was a very wealthy woman who was college educated, and she had 2 young sons. And it would turn out that Shiva's youngest child was born almost on the same day that Sumitra's child was born in December of 1984. But unlike Sumitra, who after the birth of her child felt like her life got so much better, she loved her family, she was excited about the future, for Shiva, it was the opposite. When her first child arrived, it was like her life got worse and worse and worse. Shiva's in-laws had grown to hate her. They didn't like that she was so well educated, and they hated the family she came from. And so by early 1985, when by this point Sumitra was regularly falling into those trances with her eyes rolling back and her teeth gnashing, the tension and fighting in Shiva's home, 60 miles away, was reaching an almost unbearable level. Shiva began writing these long letters that she would send to her family far away, where she would detail waking up almost every night with nightmares, screaming. And in May of 1985, which is when Sumitra began speaking during her trances, Shiva got into the biggest fight she had ever gotten into with her in-laws about attending a family wedding. And on the night of May 18th, 1985, Shiva's neighbors in her city saw Shiva's in-laws literally carrying Shiva's body, which appeared to be unconscious, as they walked along the railroad tracks. When these neighbors ran up and asked if everything was okay with Shiva, Shiva's in-laws just said, oh, she's sick and we're taking her to the hospital. Now, it was nighttime, there were no lights around, and so it was really dark, and these neighbors couldn't get a good look at Shiva to see, what was going on with her. And so even though they thought this was very strange, they decided not to say anything. The next morning, Shiva's dead body was found lying on the train tracks right near the train station. And so someone raised the alarm, and before long, Shiva's uncle and sister ran to the train station, and when they got there and saw Shiva on the tracks, they also saw Shiva's in-laws were already there. And when they spoke to Shiva's in-laws, they told the uncle and the sister that it looks like Shiva must have jumped in front of a train to commit suicide. But the uncle and sister are looking down at Shiva's body, and there appeared to be really no markings, bruises, cuts of any kind on her body that you would expect from getting hit by a train, except Shiva did have a very big mark on her head. Later on, the uncle and sister would say it looked like something had bashed Shiva's head in. Shiva's in-laws would immediately cremate Shiva's body before Shiva's actual family could stop them, and the police in this area were not good at investigating crime. So when Shiva's in-laws went to them and said, yep, she jumped in front of a train, she committed suicide, but we don't have a body because we already cremated her, the police just accepted it. Shiva's father was convinced that Shiva had been murdered, but he didn't have a way to prove it. until Sumitra appeared to die on July 19th, 1985, and then came back to life, claiming to be Shiva. Shiva's father had heard a rumor about some girl in a village 60 miles away claiming to be his dead daughter. Now, at first, Shiva's father did not believe this, but eventually he decided he would go to the village and test this girl to see if maybe it was true. And so, on October 20th, 1985, Shiva's father put on his best suit and his nicest shoes, he brought his leather-bound photo book, and he headed to Sumitra's village and knocked on her hut. Ram Tripathi was Shiva's dad. When Sumitra at first ran outside and leapt onto Ram Tripathi and hugged him and then whispered something into his ear that Sumitra's husband saw happening but couldn't hear what she said, and then Ram Tripathi, when he heard what she whispered, he kind of recoiled and acted angry for a second. What Sumitra was saying was, "Papa." In the moment, Ram Tripathi, who was not convinced Sumitra was his daughter, felt like this is a horrible, elaborate hoax and it needs to stop. But then Sumitra correctly identified 15 people in his leather-bound photo album, including the sister-in-law who she said killed her. And even more convincing than that was that Sumitra knew how Shiva had been killed, by getting smashed over the head with a brick. This was a question that Ram Tripathi had never heard the answer to before. And at that point, Ram Tripathi believed that this must be his daughter's reincarnated spirit inside of Sumitra. And so that was when he dropped the book and gave her a big hug. This story is considered to be one of the most credible reincarnation stories ever recorded. Scientists from the University of Virginia in America actually went to India to study Sumitra and interview everybody involved. And they concluded that this was not a hoax. They said that Sumitra had most likely either been possessed by or reincarnated as Shiva Duety. The change in Sumitra's voice that her family noticed was the same accent that Shiva had. It was very urban and educated. The strange new way that Sumitra wrapped her sari on her head was the same way that Shiva did. Sumitra was rude to her family and refused to eat off the same dishes as them because she believed she was actually a very wealthy woman who was for some reason being forced to live in this poor person's hut. And when Sumitra asked for Tinku and Rinku, those were nicknames that Shiva had given her two sons. And all those seemingly unhinged letters that Sumitra had written and fired off to random strangers were in fact sent to various members of Shiva's family. After Shiva's father, Ram Tripathi, brought Sumitra's story to the police would actually investigate this case and they would charge some members of Shiva's family. But ultimately, Sumitra's testimony was deemed unacceptable for court, and so the case was never officially solved. As for Shiva's in-laws, they have always denied killing her. Sumitra lived the entire rest of her life as Shiva, and Shiva's real parents accepted her as their daughter. Sumitra also came to accept her son and raised her son with her husband in their little village until she died in 1998. 16, a woman living in Chicago, Illinois named Jordan Baranskis opened her eyes and realized she had fallen asleep on the couch the night before. She looked up and the TV was still on, and then she looked down at the other section of the couch and her boyfriend Matt was also asleep on the couch. As much as she wanted to keep sleeping alongside her boyfriend, she had work that day, so she stood up, turned the TV off, and made her way upstairs to get ready. As soon as she got upstairs, the first thing she did is go into her bedroom and get her purse that she left on the foot of her bed. But when she got in the room, her purse wasn't there. So she leaves her bedroom and she starts searching all the rooms upstairs and she can't find her purse. And she's thinking to herself, I'm certain I had it the night before. I remember rifling through my purse before going downstairs and starting to fold laundry before ultimately falling asleep on the couch. So after spending about 15 minutes looking for the purse unsuccessfully, and now she's starting to stress because she's going to be late for work because she can't find her purse, she goes downstairs and she wakes Matt up and says, hey, I gotta find my purse. I thought I left it upstairs. Apparently I didn't. Can you help me look for it? Matt rolls over. He doesn't really want to get up because he's pretty tired and he doesn't have work, so he doesn't want to wake up right now. And he says, well, are you sure you didn't leave it at the restaurant last night? I mean, if you already looked, it's probably not here. You want to just give him a call and see if you left it there? Jordan was immediately really annoyed by his reaction because she just wanted him to stand up and help her look for the purse because she had work and he could just go back to sleep. And so it started this argument between the two of them where Matt just wanted her to call the restaurant because he was convinced she had it there. And Jordan was like, no, I know I had my purse. I'm positive I had it last night before I fell asleep on the couch with you. So their argument begins to escalate a little bit, and that's when Jordan remembers that they had recently installed a Nest camera downstairs to monitor their dogs whenever they were gone. And she thought, we can just look at the footage on the Nest camera, we can see me walking into the apartment, and I will either have or not have my purse in my hand. And so Jordan opens up her app and she calls Matt over, and they go back to the night before, right before they left for the restaurant. She's got her purse in hand. They leave the front door, and then several hours go by and they come back in, and very clearly Jordan has her purse in her hand. And Jordan turns to Matt and says, told you so. And Matt's like, okay, fine, let me help you look. And as they're about to put the app down, she realizes on the Nest camera timeline that motion was detected at 3:30 in the morning when they were both clearly asleep on the couch. And so she calls Matt back over and says, here, look, there's motion detected at 3:30 in the morning. And they hit play. After the couple had fallen asleep on the couch with the TV on, a hooded figure emerges from their upstairs hallway and stands at the top of the stairs and just watches the two of them sleep. Before he left, he stole her purse along with a couple of other things from their apartment. And somehow this guy has never been caught, and he's been given the nickname Creeper Ghost. Edna Centrone was born on October 10th, 1954 in Puerto Rico, and she was brought to New York by her mother when she was about 5 years old. Edna's family had no money. Her mother, who supported her, was a clerical worker at the New York City Board of Education, where she would bring 2 boiled eggs to work every day so that she wouldn't have to pay for lunch. Edna's family lived in Lower Manhattan on Delancey Street, a neighborhood that was famous for waves of ethnic immigration. Edna had a tough childhood, but she would say she was loved and had enough. In 1987, Edna would meet her future husband, William. William had been visiting his brother at his brother's girlfriend's house in Upper Manhattan. When William walked into the kitchen, Edna was sitting there, and he was so struck with her beauty, he immediately left the room, found his brother, and said, who is that woman sitting in the kitchen? And his brother would tell him that that was Edna. William went right back into the kitchen, and the two of them hit it off right away, and almost immediately they were dating. Every morning, William would leave his Brooklyn apartment and drive all the way to the north end of Manhattan. He would pick up Edna and then drive her to Midtown where she worked. And then he would fight traffic to go to his job. So it was just this horrible, horrible morning commute. But he loved Edna so much, he had no problem in the world doing it. Any chance he got to be around Edna, he was happy. A couple of months after they met, Edna would move in with William in his apartment in Brooklyn, and then 2 years later they would get married. They discovered that Edna was not able to have kids of her own, and so they talked about adopting, and they were really excited about it, but they kept pushing it off for financial reasons. Like a lot of other couples in their neighborhood, they both had to work multiple jobs in order to make ends meet. Edna worked Monday through Friday as an administrative assistant for Marsh & McLennan, which was a large insurance broker located in the World Trade Center. William was a doorman in an apartment building on the swanky Upper East Side. Monday through Friday, after he was done working as a doorman at about 3 p.m., he would go to Harlem, where he and Edna owned a small flower shop, and he would work there until 8 p.m. at night. And then over the weekends, he and Edna would work at the flower shop. For fun, they liked to drive north to Bear Mountain State Park, where they would meet up with friends and relatives for barbecues and cookouts. And anytime they had a little bit of extra money, they loved going to Atlantic City and spending a little bit of cash on the slots and then taking advantage of the free food that came with gambling. But more than anything else, William and Edna got the most enjoyment out of each other. They were madly in love and inseparable for all 14 years they were together. That even on their worst days, when they came home and things just weren't right, they would always sit down together and they would eat their favorite ice cream and watch their favorite TV show together. On September 11th, 2001, William dropped Edna off at the World Trade Center where she worked. She made her way up to the 93rd floor of the North Tower where Marsh & McLennan was. She took her seat at her desk and began the day like any other day. At 8:46 a.m. that morning, a plane that had been hijacked by Al-Qaeda terrorists intentionally flew into the North Tower, crashing into floors 93 through 99. Everyone on board the plane and hundreds of people inside the towers where it was struck were killed instantly. Edna survived the initial crash, but she, like everybody else who was at floor 92 and up inside the North Tower on 9/11, were all trapped. Shortly after the crash, a cameraman on the ground was filming the impact site on the side of the World Trade Center, and they inadvertently captured Edna Centrone coming to the edge, clutching onto a metal girder, and she appears to be waving as if she's hoping someone is going to come up here and save her. But of course, there was no way to get to her. And she, like so many others that were trapped inside of the Twin Towers, had to make the terrible choice of waiting for the fire to consume me or jumping out this window. We don't know what her final choice was. However, we do know she was one of the 2,976 people who lost their life during that terrorist attack. On September 22nd, 2006, 16-year-old Cassie Jo Stoddart was house-sitting for her aunt and uncle. Cassie was very responsible, and so her aunt and uncle didn't just trust her to house-sit, they also regularly asked her to babysit their son. During this particular house-sitting weekend, Casey had invited her boyfriend, Matt Beckham, over to the residence to watch a movie with her. She had also invited two other friends named Brian Draper and Tori Adamczyk, who were classmates of her and Matt's. And so while the four teens are watching this movie, Brian and Tori kind of awkwardly stand up and announce to the other two that they don't want to watch a movie on the TV, they want to go watch a movie in the movie theater, and they promptly leave. Cassie and Matt thought it was a little bit odd that they would come over here specifically to watch a movie with them, only to say, we don't want to watch a movie with you guys, we want to watch it in the theater, but they didn't think much of it and they stayed to finish the movie. Unbeknownst to Cassie and Matt, when Brian and Tori left, they actually looped around to the back of the residence and unlocked the basement door so they could quietly re-enter later. Because these boys had been planning to do something absolutely horrible to Cassie, and they planned on doing it that night. Brian and Tori idolized serial killers. When Brian and Tori happened to watch the movie Scream together, which is a popular horror movie where this masked villain sneaks into teenagers' homes and terrorizes them, they decided that that would be the way they gained infamy. They would reenact the murder scenes from the movie Scream, but in real life. Shortly after this revelation, they begin filming themselves as they come up with their big plan of how they're going to break into someone's home and what they're going to do to them. And at some point on camera, they would say that they've identified their first victim, and it's going to be Cassie Jo Stoddart. They just needed to wait for a time when she was going to be alone. And when they found out she was going to be house sitting over that weekend in September for her aunt and uncle, they put their plan into motion. But when they showed up and Matt Beckham was there, Cassie's boyfriend, it kind of screwed up their plan. And so that's why Brian and Tori had stood up and said they were going to go watch a movie at the movie theater, because what they really wanted to do was come back later when Matt wasn't there anymore so they could attack Cassie. So Brian and Tori leave, and they do go to the movie theater, and they do buy tickets because they figure this is a great opportunity to create a solid alibi for themselves. But they don't stick around for the movie. They get back in their car, and they drive around and film themselves excitedly talking about how great it's going to be when Cassie's all alone and they can attack her. After a couple of hours of driving around, they can't wait any longer, and they figure that Matt must be gone by now. They park at the end of the street, they get out, they put on their masks and their gloves, and they sneak around to the side of the house where there was that open door that Brian had left. They open it up and they go inside of the residence where Cassie was, and they can hear upstairs that Matt is still there. Brian and Tori at this point felt so committed that they just said, you know what, we're going to have to kill Matt too. So straight out of a horror movie, Brian and Tori hide in the basement wearing their masks and their gloves, they've got their knives, and they start making all this noise to try to get Cassie and Matt to come downstairs to see what's making all the sound. But it doesn't work. They don't come downstairs. So the next thing they do is they go to the circuit breakers and they cut the power to the house, hoping that Matt and Cassie will come downstairs to try to turn it back on. But again, Matt and Cassie stay upstairs. And so Brian and Tori turn the power back on and just continue to make sounds in the basement in hopes that Matt or Cassie, or hopefully both, would come downstairs so they could live out this fantasy. Meanwhile, upstairs, Matt and Cassie hadn't heard any of the sounds going on in the basement, but when the power went out, Cassie got really frightened and she asked Matt would he please stay with her overnight, and so Matt calls his mom and asks if that would be okay, and she says no, but you can invite Cassie over to our house and she can stay with us, and then tomorrow morning I'd be happy to drive her back to her aunt and uncle's house. But at the time the offer was made, the lights had come back on and Cassie had kind of calmed down and said, you know what, Matt, I'm actually just fine. I'm going to stay here. At approximately 10:30 p.m. that night, Brian and Tori could hear Matt's mom showing up, picking him up and taking him home. And they were fairly certain that Cassie was alone, but they were going to wait for a couple minutes to make sure she really was. As they were waiting, Matt actually called Tori and said, hey, I just left Cassie's house. Can I come meet up with you guys? And Matt would later tell police that he couldn't really understand what Tori was saying. It was like he was whispering. And so Matt assumed that he must still be in the movie theater watching the movie. And Matt kind of gave up on the idea of meeting up with them and ultimately just hung up. And so after Tori got off the phone with Matt, he turned to Brian and said, she's alone. Matt just said so. Brian and Tori turned the power off once again and then walked up the stairs and slammed a closet door in hopes that it would entice her to come into the basement. But it didn't work because Cassie was horrified. She heard the slamming door, the lights are out and she's all alone, and so she's huddled up on the couch, terrified. So Brian and Tori, frustrated they can't live out their fantasy exactly the way they wanted to by attacking her in the basement, so they go upstairs, walk into the living room where Cassie is huddled on the couch, fearing for her life, and they proceed to stab their friend to death. After the murder, Brian and Tori ran from the house, got in their car, and the first thing they did is they fired up their video camera and they filmed their excited reaction to ending Cassie's life. Brian and Tori believed they had a solid alibi because they had those movie tickets, but after Cassie's body was discovered just a couple of days later, the police immediately went to Matt Beckham, her boyfriend, and started questioning him, and he immediately said, well, Brian and Tori were the only other two people that were with us that night. The police go to Brian and Tori, and under intense questioning, Brian and Tori would confess to what they had done. They were convicted and given life sentences without the opportunity for parole. Here is some of the video footage that was found on their camera.
We found our victim, and sad as it may be, she's our friend. But you know what? We all have to make sacrifices. Our first victim is going to be Cassie Stoddard. She's going to be alone in a big, dark house out in the middle of nowhere. How perfect can you get?
I find repetition, the same sound. Lift your eyes, I find for intention. So we did nothing. Some of the most things and traces rings of pain. My tears are forever. And so we did nothing. For distrust you said no, I think that else the biggest is over. Break Southern from the forest sky sunny. We
know there's lots of doors. There's lots of places to hide. I unlocked the back doors, so it's all unlocked. Now we just gotta wait I just killed Cassie. We just left her house. I saw her lifeless body just disappear. Dude, I just killed Cassie.
So that's going to do it, guys. Let me know in the comments what you thought of today's videos, and I will pin the best comment at the top of the comments section. If you enjoyed today's video and you haven't done this already, please give the like button a wedgie, and then also subscribe to this channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss.
April 26th, 2012. A 39-year-old bouncer named Lionel Veronese opened the door of a nightclub in Chambéry, France, and he let a woman inside. And as this woman came in, she stopped and made a point to look at Lionel and smile at him and thank him by name. So Chambéry was a small city up in the Alps, and Lionel, the bouncer, was a fixture in its nightlife scene. Pretty much everybody in town who went out to the bars and clubs had either seen Lionel standing at the door outside or partying inside when he was not on the clock. And it was not just the locals who knew who this guy was. Lionel was also well known among the rich and famous tourists who often vacationed in Chambéry, and even sometimes he would pick up side work as a bodyguard for these rich and famous people. And for Lionel, I mean, his career as like sort of this fixture in the nightlife scene was fun and pretty glamorous at times, but it also could be dangerous. In fact, just a few months ago, he got into this huge fist fight protecting one of his clients, and in fact, he actually got arrested for it. But tonight, Lionel was just trying to get through a shift without any trouble. There was this long line of people who were waiting outside the club, waiting to get in, and Lionel checked their IDs one by one and let them in. And then finally, when the line started to clear, Lionel saw a familiar face walking toward him. It was his good friend, Mike Booth, who Lionel often went drinking with multiple times a week. And at first, Lionel was just really glad to see Mike. But as Mike got closer, Lionel realized that Mike actually looked really mad. And so by the time Mike actually reached Lionel just said to him, like, "Hey, what's going on? You look pretty upset." And Mike would tell him that he had just been at his friend Philippe's house, and Philippe had told him that seemed really, really weird. So Philippe Perrier, Mike's friend, the guy whose house he just came from, was extremely wealthy because his family ran this world-famous winery near Chambéry. Now, Lionel had never actually met Philippe himself, but he knew of him. His family was incredibly well-connected in town because they're so rich and they had this winery. And Mike was friends with him and often talked about him. And so now Mike explained to Lionel what this really weird thing was that he heard when he was visiting with Philippe. So apparently, Philippe's house had been robbed the day before, and Philippe believed Lionel, the bouncer, was the one who had done it. Now, Lionel immediately acted totally taken aback and began to ask Philippe, like, why in the world would he even think that? But Mike, his buddy here, just cut him off. And he's like, "Lionel, don't play dumb. Like, Philippe knows you're sleeping with his wife, Natalie. And Natalie is actually the one who's blaming you for this robbery." Now, at this, Lionel went from this sort of shock and awe reaction to actually just feeling really nervous. He actually began to sweat because, he knew it was true. He had slept with Natalie. He'd met her at a club one night a couple of months ago, and they'd hooked up in the coat check room. But Lionel realistically had a lot of flings with a lot of different women. And he'd actually pretty much completely forgotten about hooking up with Natalie, since it had just been like a casual thing and he hadn't seen her in weeks. And so he had no idea why now, suddenly, she would be accusing him of theft. Like, it doesn't really make any sense to him. So Lionel, he was genuinely stunned. He knew what he had done. He had slept with Natalie, and that's problematic. But he told Mike very truthfully that he did not break into Philippe's house. Like, there was nothing going on between he and Natalie. That was just a fling. It was nothing. Like, I really didn't do this. But Mike, despite, being friends with Lionel and knowing him quite well, did not appear to believe him. He just sort of narrowed his eyes and nodded and said, "Okay, I'll pass that along to Philippe." 3 days later, on the night of April 29th, Lionel sat in a chair in his living room in Chambéry, finishing up a phone call. So he lived in a small apartment with his mother and also his nephew, Julian. However, Julian was just 4 years younger than him, so in many ways they were more like brothers. And so as soon as Lionel hung up the phone, Julian, who was sitting in the room with him on the other side on the couch watching TV, he immediately asked Lionel, "Who were you talking to?" Lionel got up and he walked over and sat down next to Julian on the couch. And then he said to him, "Oh, that was my friend Mike. And he had just called to see if I wanted to go out tonight for a drink." And so Julian's like, "Okay, cool." And then there's a little bit of silence. And then Lionel was like, "Actually, I want to tell you something." And then he filled in Julian on the weird conversation he had had with Mike just a few days before, where basically Mike was saying that, Lionel was being accused of robbing this rich guy's home, Philippe's home. And so Julian, when he heard this, he was sort of like, this seems like a big deal. But Lionel, despite being the one to bring it up and being the one to indicate this could be a big deal, he quickly downplayed it when he saw the reaction and was just like, it is what it is. I didn't do it. And, me and Mike were back on good terms. This whole thing was just, a misunderstanding. Everything is back to normal now. Just a weird thing that happened. And so Lionel and Julian, they shifted the conversation and chatted about whatever for the next couple of minutes. And then Lionel's phone buzzed. And at the same time, he saw there were headlights pulling up outside. So Lionel grabbed his jacket and he told Julian he'd be back in a few hours. Then he went out the door. 2 days later, on the evening of May 1st, 2012, Lionel's nephew, Julian, walked into the Chambéry police station. He had spent the past 2 days very worried and stressed because Lionel had not come home after hanging out with Mike that night, and he now was not answering his phone. And Lionel was never gone for this long without giving Julian or his mother a heads up. Julian had tried to convince himself that he was just overreacting to this whole thing and that Lionel could take care of himself. He was an adult. He was a tough adult, he could handle himself. However, when he found out that Lionel also hadn't been at work for the past couple of days, Julian knew something was wrong. So Julian, after getting inside the station, he walked right up to the front desk and told them, "I need to report somebody missing." The following afternoon, so May 2nd, 2012, Captain Florent Mazarin walked into an interrogation room at the Chambéry police station. He was leading the investigation into Lionel's missing person case, and sitting inside of the interrogation room at the table was, so far, the only suspect they had in this case, Lionel's friend, Mike Booth, who he had gone out with on the night he had disappeared. So it had only been a few days since anyone had seen Lionel, but Mazarin was already sure that there was foul play involved. Chambéry was a small town, and a lot of the officers on the police force there knew Lionel, and a couple of them were pretty much adamant that Lionel was just not the kind of person who would just leave town with no warning. Julian, Lionel's nephew, had said the exact same thing when he reported Lionel missing. He also was the one who told police that the last person Lionel was with was Mike on the night he went missing. And Mike also, they found out, had recently accused Lionel of robbing someone's house. So Mazarin was really eager to get in there and hear what Mike had to say. So into the room he went. He sat down across from Mike, who seemed calm, but also definitely curious, like he wasn't sure even why he was there. And when Mazarin started in by asking him about the robbery that supposedly Lionel was involved in, Mike just nodded and explained that the break-in had happened about a week earlier at the home of his good friend, Philippe Perrier. And when Mazarin heard that name, he sort of raised an eyebrow, because like basically everybody else in Chambéry, Mazarin knew who the Perriers were. And he was surprised that someone so rich and so powerful would be running in the same circles as, sort of traditional working class men like Mike and like Lionel. However, before he could dive in and ask some basic follow-up questions about how he knows the Perriers, Mike went on to say that he ran an electrician business and he had a warehouse that was right next to Philippe's winery. So they saw each other all the time. And he said that Philippe knew Mike was friends with Lionel. And so after this break-in and robbery happened, he had asked Mike to talk to Lionel about it because he was suspicious that he had done it. But Mike said when he actually confronted Lionel just a few days ago and brought up the break-in, that Lionel had sworn he didn't know anything about it. And Mike had passed that on to Philippe. And as far as he knew, that had been the end of it. Like they were not going to continue to assume that Lionel had anything to do with it. Now, Mike was being so earnest as he told the story that Mazarin thought there was a good chance he was simply telling the truth here, and that this robbery thing was really just a big misunderstanding. However, when Mazarin asked Mike where he had been on Sunday night, when Lionel was last seen, presumably with Mike, Mike's whole demeanor changed. He began to visibly shift in his seat and began looking down at the table instead of eye contact with Mazarin, and then he just said that he had been home all night with his girlfriend. He did say at a certain point he had called Lionel to try to make plans with him for that night, but they'd never actually met up and they didn't see each other. Now, at this point, Mazarin was pretty confident that Mike was lying. not just because of Mike's very obvious change in body language, but Leonel's nephew had sworn he had seen Mike's car outside their building on that night that Mike is saying he did not meet up with Leonel. Now, it was possible that Julian had been mistaken, but if Mike was lying to the police about having been with Leonel on the night he disappeared, well, that made Mike seem very, very suspicious. And so Mazarin just put Mike on the spot and said, okay, give me your girlfriend's name and her contact information so I can confirm your alibi. And so he did. He handed it over. And then Mazarin got up, left the interrogation room, and went to go give her a call. On the evening of May 2nd, 2012, so just a few hours after questioning Mike Booth about Leonel's disappearance, Captain Mazarin drove up to a big house in a quiet, wealthy suburb just outside of Chambéry, France. Now, by this point, he had already spoken to Mike's girlfriend, who had confirmed what Mazarin was already thinking, which was Mike was lying about spending the whole night of Leonel's disappearance at home with her. In fact, she said that Mike hadn't been home at all. She said she had been at home by herself all night. She had watched a movie, and then at some point she had fallen asleep, maybe around midnight. And at that point, when she fell asleep, Mike still was not back from wherever he was. So right now, Mike was not only their sole suspect, but he was also their best suspect. Mazarin knew that a few days before Leonel's disappearance, Mike had confronted Leonel about this supposed robbery at Philippe Perrier's house. And so now Mazarin was at Philippe's house to see what he had to say about the whole situation. And so Mazarin pulled his car up in front of the house, he parked, he got out, he walked up to the front door, and he rang the doorbell. And a moment later, Philippe himself opened the door. And he seemed genuinely surprised to see Mazarin standing there. And so he quickly asked Mazarin if he was here to follow up on the robbery investigation. And Mazarin said, sort of. Mazarin said, for now, he just wanted to know if he could come inside and they could chat. And for a moment, it seemed, at least to Mazarin, that Philippe sort of hesitated, like he didn't necessarily want to do that. But then he sort of relaxed and nodded and said, sure. And he let Mazarin inside. And so Mazarin, he stepped inside of this beautiful house that was very well furnished, and he was led to the living room. And Mazarin took a seat, and then after Philippe sat down as well, he asked Philippe to walk him through what had happened with this supposed robbery. Philippe explained that his wife Natalie had come home one afternoon, and when she had come into the living room, she saw one of the windows had been shattered. And then Mazarin said that, after seeing this, they searched the house and they eventually went downstairs to the basement where their safe was, and they found their safe had been broken into as well, and a lot of cash that had been in there was gone. Philippe said he had called the police about it and they'd come out to investigate, but so far he hadn't heard anything. And so Mazarin, after hearing this, asked Philippe if he thought he knew who was responsible. And Philippe immediately nodded and said yes. Then he repeated what Mike Booth had said. It was Leonel Veronese. And the reason he knew that was Leonel was having an affair with his wife Natalie, and Natalie said it was Leonel. Mazarin looked really hard at Philippe because this was huge. If Philippe knew that Leonel was having an affair with his wife, that gave him, Philippe, plenty of motive to want Leonel dead. And as of right now, Leonel was gone and no one knew what happened to him, so maybe he was murdered. And so, operating on a hunch, Mazarin followed up by asking Philippe if he had any weapons in the house. And to his surprise, Philippe said yes. And so Mazarin asked if he could see them. And so Philippe got up and led him over to the stairs that went down to the basement. And when they got down there, there was this huge gun safe with a few plastic firearm cases stacked around it. And so Philippe, once they got down there, he sort of stepped out of the way so that Mazarin could look around. And almost as soon as he did begin walking around Mazarin and began opening up these cases, he discovered that one of those cases, which had space for 2 weapons in it, was empty. And so Mazarin asked Philippe, hey, where are the 2 guns that go in this case? And Philippe said, actually, those were stolen during the robbery. However, after hearing this, and as Mazarin is staring at this empty gun case, something just was not adding up. Philippe clearly had a motive to want to hurt Leonel, because he was having an affair with his wife. And he happened to have 2 missing guns? Now, of course, at this point, Mazarin did not know if Leonel was definitely, dead, and therefore couldn't know if he had been shot or not. But still, this was really suspicious. But at the same time, Philippe was from this very wealthy and highly respected family. He didn't really seem like the kind of person who would go around murdering or kidnapping people in revenge. And if he had, let's say, done something bad to Lionel, it was just odd that he would just so readily admit to clearly having a motive to harm Lionel and to show the detective a basement full of weapons, including a gun case that was missing weapons. And so, basically, until Mazarin was able to figure out what actually happened to Lionel, until that time, he would have a really hard time proving that Philippe had anything to do with it. The next morning, Captain Mazarin was in his office at the police station, going over the notes from his interview with Philippe to see if there was anything he missed. At this point, Mazarin's theory was that either Mike or Philippe, or maybe even both of them, had gone to confront Lionel about the affair and about the robbery, and then things had turned violent. But just then, there was a knock on his door, and Mazarin turned and he saw his door was open, and there was this woman standing there, and her face was stained with tears, and when she walked into the room, she sort of was heavy and stumbling, like she was maybe on drugs, or maybe drunk, or maybe on heavy medication, and she sort of stumbled into the room and then introduced herself as Natalie Perrier. So Mazarin had actually earlier called on her to come in and speak to him, both to verify her husband's story about what happened, the robbery, the affair, and also to see what else she might know about Lionel. And also, since she clearly was involved in this whole potential love triangle here, he had to also consider her as a potential suspect in whatever happened to Lionel. So he gestured for Natalie to take a seat, and then once she had, he asked her to tell him all about how she had met Lionel. Natalie, at this point, really clearly could not sort of keep herself together. She kept apologizing and kept explaining that she was on prescription medication that made it really hard for her to keep a grip on her emotions, and this whole situation had really rattled her. But eventually, after this sort of setup about how sorry she is and what a mess she is, she eventually tells Mazarin that she had met Lionel at a nightclub and that, yes, they had hooked up a few times, but since the last time, they hadn't seen each other, and it had been quite a while, like it was nothing. When Mazarin asked her about the robbery, she said that Lionel had told her about having serious gambling debts from playing poker, and so because of that, she had just sort of naturally suspected that he must have robbed them. She also added that, just to be clear, her and Philippe were both at their home all night on the evening that Lionel disappeared, and that if Philippe had gone to confront Lionel at any point, she did not know anything about it. And so at this point, Mazarin sat back in his chair and just considered what he was seeing and what he was hearing. Natalie seemed genuinely devastated by this whole situation. To Mazarin, it seemed like she was believable, that she was coming in here telling the truth. And so he really doubted that she directly had anything to do with Lionel's disappearance. However, while Natalie's emotional state certainly made her seem less likely as a suspect, Mazarin wondered if maybe her tears were a clue. By her own account, she'd only had a fleeting relationship with Lionel, not some, passionate relationship or something. So maybe the reason she's this upset is because she actually knows that her husband was involved in what happened to Lionel. A few days later, Captain Mazarin walked through a wooded rural area near the coast, 220 miles away from Chambéry. An officer from the Marseille police was walking a few steps ahead of him. This officer had called Mazarin yesterday to tell him that a body had been discovered in these woods just after dawn on April 30th, so less than 10 hours after Lionel was last seen by his family. And after running the body's fingerprints through the database, they had identified the victim. It was Lionel. And Mazarin was baffled by this. Marseille was more than a 4-hour drive from Chambéry. And as far as Mazarin knew, Lionel didn't know anybody in Marseille and did not go there with any regularity. And there was just plenty of other wooded areas closer to Chambéry. So why drive all the way out here? It just didn't really make any sense. And so Mazarin continued following this officer, and at some point, they stepped into this small clearing, and Mazarin saw there was a pile of burnt logs and branches sort of lying in the grass right in the middle, and the other officer said that this was the spot where Lionel was found. And then the officer pulled out a folder that had photos of Lionel's body. And so Mazarin was being brought here just to see exactly where it had been found. And so Mazarin looked down at the photo, and what he saw was, in the spot that he was standing near, there was this smoldering bonfire. It was clearly out, but there was still smoke coming off of it. And then in the middle of all these logs was clearly a charred corpse. The officer that brought him here explained that the medical examiner had found a gunshot wound in the back of Lionel's head. So it did appear that he was actually killed before he was set on fire. And so as Mazarin was taking all this new information in, everything just started to make sense. So this was exactly how drug trafficking gangs in France typically disposed of bodies. The police even had a name for it. They called it a barbecue. The gangs would shoot their victims in the head and then burn their bodies over a bonfire to make them harder to identify. Mazarin had assumed that Lionel's murder was a revenge killing. But now it actually looked more likely that this could have been a gang execution. None of Lionel's family or friends had ever mentioned that he was involved with a gang in any way, but Mazarin knew that Lionel worked in nightclubs and had a history of breaking up fights, so it was definitely possible that he might have crossed paths with the wrong person. Also, there was the fact that apparently Lionel had these huge debts from gambling. There's just sort of a seedy underworld that potentially he was around that could have led to him being killed this way. Also, if this was gang-related, it would sort of explain why he was all the way out here in Marseille, because Marseille was a city that historically had a lot of issues with drug trafficking and gangs. And so Mazarin realized he could have been wrong about this case basically from the start. Maybe Mike and Philippe actually had nothing to do with it at all. Around 10 p.m. on May 5th, 2012, about 100 miles from the spot where Lionel's body was found, Captain Florent Mazarin pulled into the parking lot of a gas station. He got out, he walked inside, and told the clerk that he needed to look at the security camera footage. So during the 4-hour drive from Marseille back to Chambéry, so after Mazarin had gone out and seen where Lionel had been found during that ride home, he had been going back and forth between his first two suspects, Mike and Philippe, and this new theory that a gang had killed Lionel. And so he wasn't really sure how he was going to navigate, what to do here with running these two sort of simultaneous investigations. But as he's driving, as he's on his way back home, he realizes there might actually be a way to prove whether or not either Mike or Philippe were involved in this killing. There were only two roads that connected Chambéry to Marseille. And so Lionel's killer or killers must have driven down one of them at some point during the night of April 29th. So Mazarin had been checking the cameras at every toll booth and every gas station that he passed on his drive to see if any of them had captured a glimpse of Lionel. So far, he'd just been disappointed because most of the cameras didn't even work, or the footage had already been erased or written over. And so now, as he followed this clerk into the back room and was shown to their computer to go ahead and look at the footage, Mazarin was expecting that this stop would be the same as all the others, a big disappointment. However, as soon as they fired up the computer, right away Mazarin saw that they did have footage, and the footage did cover the time period he was looking for. However, when he began scanning the footage around the date of April 29th, April 30th, at first nothing stood out. However, when he reached the early hours of April 30th, where he would normally stop and say, okay, I didn't see anything, it is what it is, for whatever reason, he decided to just keep on scanning the footage, just keep on watching more of April 30th. And eventually, he did see something of interest. At 5:43 a.m. on April 30th, a black Volkswagen vehicle pulls into frame, and it actually parks in the gas station parking lot. And this car, its license plate ended in 73, which meant this car was registered in Chambéry. He's watching this car, comes into the lot, it parks, and the driver gets out. And right away, Mazarin pauses the video and he zooms in on the driver's face, but the video was just too grainy. He couldn't tell who the driver was. But then something in the passenger seat of this car catches his attention. And so he zoomed in on the passenger seat, and when he realized what he was looking at, his stomach just dropped. Based on that video, forensic evidence, and interviews with witnesses, this is what police believe happened to Lionel Veronese on April 29th, 2012. Around 10:15 p.m., the killer sat in the back seat of a car as it drove through the streets of Chambéry with a gun resting on the seat next to them. Now, the killer had told the driver that they were not planning to use the gun tonight. It was just there for intimidation. However, the killer's emotions were really running high, and they honestly weren't even sure what they were going to do when they saw Lionel. And so the car kept on driving along until eventually it came to a stop outside of an apartment building, and then a few seconds later, the passenger side front door opened up and Lionel climbed inside the car. As the driver put the car back into gear and started driving down the road, the killer from the back seat confronted Lionel about something that had really been bothering them. And it gradually turned into a very heated argument, and then, at some point, the killer raised that gun they weren't going to use, aimed at the back of Lionel's head, and fired. The driver immediately whipped around and looked at the killer and just stared at them. They seemed completely shocked by this crazy sudden escalation here, but they didn't stop driving. Instead, they stepped on the gas and sped down the road until they reached a house. And then the killer and the driver both went inside of that house and they formulated a plan for what would happen next. So the plan was the driver, along with another accomplice who was in the house they went to, would drive down to Marseille. They would find a secluded spot out in the woods, they'd make a bonfire, and they would burn Lionel's body. That's how they dispose of it. And then on the way back, their plan was to toss all the evidence into the river. As for the killer, the one who actually pulled the trigger, they were going to stay at this house. They were not going to leave. The driver and the other accomplice agreed that the killer had already caused enough trouble for one night. So the killer just went upstairs into their bedroom, they slipped on a robe, and they watched from the window as the other two got into the car and drove off. The killer was Philippe's wife, Natalie Perrier, the woman Lionel had had an affair with. To Lionel, their affair had been meaningless, just a fling. But for Natalie, she wanted more. She'd gotten bored of her quiet life as a luxurious housewife in the suburbs, and she'd quickly fallen in love with Lionel and the seemingly very exciting life that he lived. And so when Lionel stopped paying attention to her, she'd gotten so mad that she took revenge. She went with Mike to pick up Lionel on the night he was killed so that she could confront him. But moments after Lionel got in the car, her emotions got the best of her, and she shot and killed him. And this was definitely not the plan that Mike had agreed to. Like, he and her had discussed what was going to happen. It didn't include murdering Lionel. But after the murder, Mike didn't say, I'm going to go to the police. Instead, he and Natalie went to her husband, Philippe, for help. And Philippe agreed to dispose of Lionel's body and cover up the crime. On the security footage from the gas station, what Mazarin saw in the passenger seat of that black Volkswagen was Philippe. He was sitting there, just right in the passenger seat, and it would turn out the driver of the car was Mike. Natalie was ultimately convicted of Lionel's murder and sentenced to 20 years in prison. Mike was sentenced to 6 years for kidnapping and destroying evidence, and Philippe was sentenced to 3 years for helping get rid of Lionel's body. He and Natalie are now divorced, and also as for that robbery that played seemingly a central role in the story at the beginning, we actually don't know if the robbery ever occurred or if it was simply a fabrication. June 20th, 1997 started out as a perfect day for Henry Kaniva. The wiry, silver-mustached 76-year-old arrived at the Toyota dealership in Sarasota shortly after dawn. Getting to work early meant that he got first pick of the morning customers, which was how he liked it. By lunch, he'd already made 2 sales, and he was working on his third. And when that third customer signed for her car, Henry handed her the keys and felt that familiar rush of victory. He'd worked plenty of jobs throughout his life, but selling cars was the first thing that he truly loved, and he was really good at it. Henry had an effortless charm and a sort of unthreatening quality that made people trust him. He enjoyed talking to strangers, and he had no plans of slowing down or retiring. Growing up in the Great Depression had imprinted on him a set of unshakable values. He believed that you should work hard, save every dime you can, and treat every day like it's your last. And that mindset had served him well over the years. But life still had come with plenty of setbacks. 2 decades ago, his marriage had fallen apart, and so he'd upended his life and moved from California to Florida. Finding a new job there had been easy with Henry's sales experience, but he had not expected to find love again, too. He'd met his current girlfriend, Janet Scott, a little over 6 years earlier, when Janet had come into Henry's dealership looking to buy a car. She'd left with a car, and also with Henry's phone number. Their relationship quickly progressed from friendly dinners to romance. And Janet never seemed to mind that she was 26 years younger than Henry. She laughed at his jokes, loved his cooking, and put up with his constant car talk. Janet was also a salesperson in her own way. She worked at the Hallmark store at the Sarasota Square Mall, selling cards, chocolates, and stuffed animals. And that day, while Henry was getting ready to sell his third car, Janet was helping a shopper pick out a condolences card for a funeral. As she pulled different options from the rack, Janet couldn't help but feel a twinge of heartache. It was not that long ago that her own mailbox had been flooded with cards like these. Just before she met Henry, her husband, Roe, had died from a heart attack. Janet still wore the diamond engagement ring that Roe had given her, right next to the inexpensive topaz one that Henry had gotten her a few years earlier. She was comfortable in her relationship with Henry, but she knew not to expect a wedding ring from him. Henry had never actually gotten around to filing divorce paperwork for his first marriage, so he was still legally married to his ex in California, and they had 2 adult kids together, a son and a daughter. But Henry hardly ever spoke to his kids these days, which made Janet sad. She'd seen the same thing happen to her late husband. Roe had had an adult daughter from a former marriage, and they'd grown distant after Roe married Janet. Janet thought that Roe had regretted not repairing that relationship before he died, and so she didn't want Henry to die without getting a chance to patch things up with his kids. But she wasn't sure how to help him do that. As upbeat and charming as Henry was, he could also be very private and stuck in his ways. But Janet took a last look at the condolence card her customer chose and resolved to talk to Henry about his kids that night. After purchasing their card, the customer left, and Janet began closing up the store. 20 minutes later, she was driving past sandy white beaches teeming with senior citizens. Sarasota was a magnet for people like Henry, looking to spend their twilight years in the Florida sun. Pretty soon, Janet reached the peaceful neighborhood of Mirror Lake. Janet's spacious 1-story house was at the very end of the road, with a red back door looking out to the water. Her late husband, Roe, had lived there with his first family before he met Janet, and then Janet lived there throughout their marriage, and she inherited the place when Roe died. Now, because Roe literally had died in this house, initially, Janet felt hesitant about the idea of letting Henry move in. But Henry had eventually sold her on the idea of him moving in by pointing out how much money they would save if he gave up his apartment. And so he moved in. When Janet walked in the door, she was immediately hit with a delicious smell wafting in from the kitchen. She smiled as she watched Henry move about the kitchen, dashing over for a kiss before hurrying back to the oven. Any discomfort that she might have felt about Henry living here in Roe's old house clearly was not shared. Henry had made himself right at home. After dinner, Janet cuddled on the couch with Henry and her dog Kissy while they watched some local news. And then, around 11 p.m., she remembered her plan to talk to Henry about his kids. But when she looked over at Henry, she could see he was already drifting off to sleep, so Janet switched off the TV and sent her fiancé to bed. The conversation could wait. Janet took Kissy out to the backyard for a quick walk, and then, after coming back inside, she headed to their bedroom, where she removed her rings and set them on the nightstand before climbing into bed beside Henry. The next thing Janet knew, she was dragged from sleep by this blinding pain. And then her surprise gave way to terror when she realized someone was sitting on top of her, pinning her to the bed with their knees while twisting at her neck. Janet started to scream and thrash, but her attacker just punched her repeatedly in the head and chest. Janet tasted blood and started to black out, but she kept struggling, trying to get free. And suddenly, she and her attacker fell off the bed and hit the floor. But before she could get back to her feet, she felt a pull on her legs, and her attacker was right back on top of her, squeezing at her throat. Janet made a final attempt to push her attacker off, But by this point, she was exhausted and disoriented, and slowly, everything went black. Sometime later, Janet woke up on her bedroom floor. Her temple and her throat throbbed with pain, but her attacker was gone. At least they weren't on top of her anymore, and she couldn't see anybody else in the room. Janet lifted her head, trying her best to ignore the pain. She couldn't see much, since it was pitch black in the room and one of her eyes was swollen shut. But as she sat up, Janet heard something. A hoarse, raspy wheezing sound. She didn't know where the sound was coming from or what it could be. All she knew was she needed to get away right now. Painfully, she got up and fumbled through the dark until she found the landline phone on the small vanity table. She picked it up to call the police, but the line was dead. And so Janet left the phone and staggered down the hall and went out the back door. And from there, she headed over to her neighbor's home. When she got there, she desperately banged on the door until her neighbor, a woman named Kathy Peters, answered. And when the neighbor, Kathy, looked out and saw Janet standing there with her shattered face, she was so surprised that she immediately jumped backwards in fright. Janet was actually so bruised and bloodied that Kathy did not recognize her at first. But when she realized who was standing there, she pulled Janet inside, locked the door, and ran to call 911. An ambulance arrived within minutes to take Janet to the hospital, and not a moment too soon. Even as the EMTs loaded her onto the stretcher, she was already losing consciousness again. At almost the same time, several sheriff's deputies arrived at Janet's house. They found the back door unlocked, and so they headed inside. The moment they entered the master bedroom, the deputies knew there had been an extremely violent attack here. Drawers had been pulled from the dresser and dumped all over the floor. There was blood spatter on the blinds and all over the sheets, and a thick puddle of blood was on the floor right where Janet fell. And there, lying on the bed, was Henry. His face was covered in blood, and he had a belt cinched tightly around his neck. The deputies checked him for a pulse, but the man was obviously dead from strangulation. After discovering Henry's body, the deputies began searching the room. One of the deputies was down on his hands and knees, peering under the bed, when he got startled by a pair of eyes staring back at him. It was Janet's dog, Kissy, cowering under the bed, shaking in terror. She refused to come out when the deputy called to her, so he crawled under and pulled her out. Once the deputy had the dog in his arms, it became clear that Kissy was not just terrified. Her eyes were dilated like she had a concussion, and there was some blood around her head, suggesting she had been beaten too. One of the deputies volunteered to take Kissy to a local pet hospital, and as he was leaving with the dog, another car pulled up and two men got out. They were Mark Brewer and Keith Muncy, detectives from the Sarasota Police Homicide Division who would now be taking lead on the case. The two detectives headed inside to join the deputies, who quickly brought them up to speed. Right away, they were struck by the brutality of Henry's murder. He'd been strangled to death with his own belt while he was sleeping, and he'd also been badly beaten. The sheer violence that must have been involved here gave this crime a very personal feeling. The detectives also noticed that while the bedroom had been ransacked, it didn't seem like anything had been taken. For example, Henry's wallet with some money and credit cards in it was just out on a dresser. And so this made the detectives think that this probably was not a robbery. Next, they checked the landline phone, which was still lying off the hook where Janet had dropped it. The line was dead, so Detective Muncy headed out to the backyard, where he confirmed that the phone lines had been cut. He was heading back inside when a flash of white on the ground caught his eye. It was a cigarette butt, lying at the edge of the property. And while the grass was wet from some light rain earlier that night, this cigarette butt was dry, meaning it had been dropped within the last few hours. Muncy went inside to share this discovery with Detective Brewer, and after doing so, it would turn out Brewer also had some news of his own. He had found the fingertip of a latex glove in the bedroom. The detectives now had two pieces of evidence that might have the killer's fingerprints or DNA material on them. But the lab was backed up, and so testing these items would take time. And so they were hoping that long before they needed the results of those tests, their eyewitnesses could actually just help them solve the crime. So they headed to the hospital to interview the one person, aside from the killer, who was there when Henry was murdered, Janet. Unfortunately, though, when they arrived at the hospital, Janet was unconscious again. And also, one of the doctors warned that with the extent of the injuries she'd sustained, she could actually die. And so Brewer and Muncie were suddenly facing the possibility of a double murder. They asked the hospital staff to call them if Janet woke up. In the meantime, the detectives began digging into Henry's life to try and understand why someone had wanted to kill him. When they got access to his bank accounts, they were surprised by just how much money Henry had put away. Henry sort of gave off the vibe that he was a senior citizen on a limited fixed budget. But in reality, he had $700,000 in the bank. So the detectives speculated that maybe Henry was killed for his money. And their thoughts immediately turned toward Henry's relatives, who were most likely to gain financially from his death. The detectives learned that Henry did not have a will, but that only meant that the bulk of the inheritance would be divided between his adult children, Jeff and Sharon Geneva. When the detectives reached out to Jeff and Sharon, they learned that they were actually already on their way to Sarasota after learning their father had been killed. And at the detectives' request, they agreed to stop by the station to answer some questions. Brewer and Muncie knew it was impossible for Jeff or Sharon to have been present for the murder, since they were across the country in California when it happened. But that did not stop them from potentially arranging a hit through a third party. The detectives pressed the siblings about how they got along with their father. And both Jeff and Sharon said they were on good terms with Henry, but they didn't really talk to him very much. Not because they didn't want to. Jeff clearly idolized his father and had even followed in his father's footsteps to become a car salesman. But they said their father liked his privacy and didn't want many visitors. He seemed happy with the new life he'd built in Florida, so they tried to give him space and let him be. But then Jeff dropped some truly shocking information. A few months earlier, he had called his father at home, and a young man had answered. When Jeff asked who he was talking to, the man said he was Henry's son. Jeff was initially stunned and very confused because he believed he was Henry's only son. But eventually, the truth came out. Soon after Henry had separated from Jeff and Sharon's mother and moved to Florida, he was in a very brief relationship with a woman who gave birth to Henry's other son, David. But Henry never told anybody about David, and Henry himself didn't even meet him until David had grown up and tracked him down. But from what Jeff was able to gather, it seemed like Henry and his son David had seen a lot of each other in the months leading up to the murder. It stung more than Jeff liked to admit, both because Henry had kept David's existence a secret and because he'd been so unavailable to his other kids. Following the conversation with Jeff and his sister Sharon, detectives Brewer and Muncie got to work tracking David down. They learned that he was 20 years old and lived about 3 hours away in the Daytona Beach area. When they contacted him, he agreed to come down to Sarasota for questioning. And during his interview, he admitted that he knew Henry had a lot of money, but didn't know how much or if Henry had a will. David confirmed that he had been spending more time with Henry recently, and that some of the visits had taken place at the house in Mirror Lake, where the murder took place. Most recently, David said he and Henry had watched sports together on TV on Father's Day, which happened to be just 4 days before Henry was killed. All these details made the detectives suspicious of David. After all those years without seeing his father, David was suddenly spending lots of time with him? Was he trying to get Henry's money? Did he secretly nurse a deep grudge against Henry? Either way, David did know his way around Henry's home, and also David was a big man who'd be quite physically capable of strangling a sleeping 76-year-old. David's alibi for the night of the murder was also pretty weak. David told the detectives that he was with his girlfriend that night. And while she did confirm that was true, Brewer and Muncie knew she could just be lying for him. So, ultimately, the detectives pressured David to take a polygraph test. And the results came back inconclusive. Now, of course, polygraph tests are not 100% accurate. I mean, people can lie and they can fake their answers, and a positive result could actually be a negative and vice versa. But at a minimum, an inconclusive test meant that David remained very much a potential suspect. The detectives were still interested in Henry's other two children as well, and Henry's funeral, held about a week after the murder, gave the detectives a chance to observe all three kids together. And right away, Brewer and Muncie could see there was almost palpable tension between David, Jeff, and Sharon. And also, they could overhear very testy conversations between the siblings. At one point, David commented that he was looking forward to buying jet skis with his inheritance. This did not go over well with Jeff, who was already feeling very jealous about Henry spending his last Father's Day with David instead of him, and so he got angry and accused David of being involved in the murder. David walked away before the argument could go any further, and for the remainder of the funeral, the siblings basically avoided each other. The detectives agreed it was not that surprising that the siblings didn't get along. However, them not getting along did not necessarily mean they killed their father. But regardless, Brewer and Muncie decided to still keep an eye on all of Henry's children while they simultaneously dug into his other relationships. The following day, the detectives headed to the Toyota dealership where Henry worked to interview some of his colleagues. And one of Henry's buddies, a guy named Red, was more than happy to help. Red said the other salesmen definitely respected Henry due to his long history in the business, but they also saw him as being pretty old-fashioned and would sometimes give him a hard time about being cheap. They couldn't understand why he wore old, ill-fitting clothes and drove a 10-year-old car when they knew he had money. It was common knowledge around the dealership that Henry had made more than the rest of them put together, just from the number of cars Henry had sold. As one salesman put it, Henry had, quote, more money than God. The detectives jotted all this down and then asked Red if there was anyone on the staff who might have wanted to harm Henry. Red thought for a moment and then told them they should go talk to a guy named Mark. Red explained that Mark was a younger salesman who had worked at the dealership until recently. He was argumentative and lazy and would often miss work, sometimes disappearing for as much as a week at a time. Mark's laziness really rubbed Henry the wrong way, and at one point he had tried to talk some sense into Mark, but Mark just sort of blew him off. And soon after that, Mark was abruptly fired, just a few days before Henry's murder. Now, Red didn't know if Henry had formally complained to management, which sort of led to Mark's firing, but Red said, Henry had been vocal enough about his dislike of Mark that most of the other employees assumed that Henry must have had something to do with Mark's firing. The detectives interviewed more of the salesmen and heard similar stories. Some people thought Mark was actually a drug addict, and that was why he disappeared sometimes. And a few of the salesmen recounted that Mark had been looking for a gun right around the time he got fired. He had told them he needed it to, quote, take care of something. Armed with all these stories, detectives Brewer and Muncie tracked down Mark and brought him into the Sarasota police station for questioning. Mark had a bad attitude right away and acted annoyed at them for wasting his time. While Mark said he did not know anything about Henry's murder, he also said that yes, he and Henry had butted heads. He said that Henry wanted to be treated like the dealership king simply because he'd been there the longest. Mark said that Henry was always butting into other people's business, and as far as Mark was concerned, Henry had gotten what he deserved. Naturally, Brewer and Muncie found this kind of talk extremely suspicious, so they pressed Mark harder. They told him that they'd found a latex glove fragment at the crime scene with fingerprints on it. Now, this was a total bluff on their part. They'd already analyzed that glove fragment, and it was clean of prints. But Mark didn't know that. And if he was guilty, thinking that the police had hard evidence could make him crack. But instead, Mark responded somewhat sarcastically, saying that, yeah, finding that glove at the scene would make me a good suspect, because my sister is a nurse, and so I have access to gloves just like that. The detectives thought this was a very strange thing to say, even if it was sarcastic. I mean, Mark was technically incriminating himself in a murder investigation, but Mark just did not seem to care. Brewer and Muncie just sat there, trying to make sense of what Mark had just said, when they got a call from the hospital. Janet was awake, and it looked like she was going to survive. And while she was still weak and in a lot of pain, she had said she was ready to answer their questions. The detectives were so eager to hear from her that they let Mark go for the moment and raced over to the hospital. But when they finally sat down with Janet, it became clear she was not going to be as helpful as they'd hoped. Janet was not just beaten up. She was severely traumatized and confused about what had happened. Doctors said the first thing that she had asked when she regained consciousness was, "Where's Henry?" When Brewer and Muncie gently pressed her to try to focus and remember any details, she tried, but then suddenly got this crushing headache and had to stop. And then a couple of minutes later, when her headache kind of faded, she told them that all she could remember was being beaten and strangled by this faceless dark figure, and then a little bit after that, she remembered waking up on the ground, hearing this horrible rattling wheezing sound. To help jog her memory, Brewer showed Janet some crime scene photos of the bedroom that were taken after the attack. Janet looked closely at all the pictures, but still, she just could not remember anything else. However, she did notice something in one of the photos. Her 2 rings that she had placed on the nightstand were missing. And so at this point, the detectives knew that perhaps the stolen rings indicated that this was a robbery after all. Maybe the killer was planning to take more, but got spooked by the dogs barking and ran. But on the other hand, the fact that just these rings appeared to be missing and that they had sentimental value could point to a personal connection between the killer and the victims. As important as Janet's realization about the rings was, it didn't really provide the detectives with any new clear answers. Their investigation so far had turned up some strong suspects, including Mark, the shady car salesman, and the 3 Kaniva children, Jeff, Sharon, and their half-brother David, but as it stood, police did not have enough evidence to build a case against any one of them. So all the detectives could do now was just keep an eye on the suspects and hope that Janet's memory improved. But weeks and then months passed with no progress in the case or any change to Janet's memory, and so the investigation began to go cold. Then, in December of 1997, a full 6 months after Henry's murder, a clue dropped into the detectives' laps that changed everything. In a seemingly unrelated case, Sarasota police deputies responded to a domestic violence call at another house on Mirror Lake, across the water from Janet's place. This was not the first time they'd had to break up a fight at this home. A few months earlier, 39-year-old John Whiteley had pinned his girlfriend, 40-year-old Leela Hodges, between the washing machine and the wall, trapping her there. Leela had forgiven him for that incident, but now he'd attacked her again. And as the police once again separated the couple, John got the impression that he was about to be placed under arrest. And so he shouted that Leela had better keep her mouth shut and not accuse him of anything, or else he would tell them about the rings. Then, as if to prove he wasn't bluffing, he shouted to the deputies, "Hey, you guys want to know something about a murder?" Now, at this point, after John had said all this stuff, the deputies were all thinking of the same thing: Henry's murder case. Now, they all knew that 2 rings had been taken from the crime scene, but that detail had never been made public, which meant this couple, specifically John, might actually know something about Henry's murder. As soon as Detective Brewer and Muncie got word about John and Leela, they were convinced the couple must have had something to do with Henry's murder. They just couldn't figure out how John and Leela were connected to him. So, out of desperation, they decided to go back and talk to Janet one last time. Unfortunately, Janet still could not remember anything more about the attack. So, Brewer and Muncie came up with an idea. They were going to try to hypnotize her. It was unorthodox, but at this point, they were willing to try anything. And Janet was on board. So, the next day, the detectives returned, now with a hypnotist, who put Janet into a trance. And then while she was in her trance, they asked her a series of questions, designed to draw out her repressed memories from the attack. And suddenly, it was like Janet could hear and see things from the night of the attack that she hadn't been able to before. Finally, when the hypnotist asked her to describe her attacker, Janet grew quiet. She still could not picture their face, but she did remember something else. Under hypnosis, Janet recalled waking up to find a large, shadowy figure sitting on her thighs while violently grabbing her neck. Janet tried to fight, but it didn't do any good. Then, as the killer continued to throttle her, she became aware of another set of hands on her shoulders. A second person that she couldn't see was holding her to the ground. That meant there were 2 attackers in the bedroom that night, not just one. Janet's revelation stunned the detectives at first, but they quickly realized several of their suspects came in pairs. The first pair was Henry's first set of kids, Jeff and Sharon. They stood to benefit the most from Henry's death, as they knew they would inherit a portion of his small fortune. But that also applied to David, Jeff and Sharon's 20-year-old half-brother. David's girlfriend had provided him with an alibi. Now, the detectives wondered if maybe she'd help David commit the crime, thinking his inheritance would benefit her too, making David and her a pair. The third set of suspects was John and Leela, the couple from the domestic abuse call. While they didn't seem to have a motive, or even really a connection, they lived nearby and seemed to know information that was not shared with the public. The only suspect who did not come with a potential accomplice was Mark, the salesman who was fired days before the murder. While it was still possible that he had killed Henry over a grudge, or maybe as part of a robbery, the detective still had no idea who he would have worked with. That night, after leaving the hospital, Brewer and Muncie holed up in their office and read through the files for each set of suspects, searching for any detail they might have missed. And they were starting to lose steam when Muncie stumbled upon something that made him pause. It was a single word buried in one of the suspects' files. Muncie showed it to Brewer, who immediately jumped to his computer to pull up more details on that suspect. And as his screen filled with information, everything began to fall into place. Based on the evidence collected at the crime scene and interviews conducted throughout the investigation, the following is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Henry Kaniva and Janet Scott on the night of June 20th, 1997. A little before 3 a.m., 2 figures crept along the bank of Mirror Lake. They were wearing black clothes and latex gloves, and the leader was smoking a cigarette. As they reached the edge of Janet's property, the leader put out the cigarette and dropped it into the wet grass. Then the pair hurried across the lawn to the house, where the leader used pliers to cut the phone line that was running along the exterior wall. They found the back door was unlocked, so they slipped inside. Once inside, the accomplice led the way to the master bedroom, where they found Henry and Janet fast asleep in bed. But the couple was not alone. Janet's dog, Kissy, was lying at her feet. When the killers entered, the dog jumped off the bed and began barking. The accomplice stepped forward and delivered a powerful kick that sent Kissy flying against the wall. She fell down and went limp. The killers quickly glanced back over at the bed, and they were relieved to see that Janet and Henry were still asleep. So they moved ahead with their plan. The leader found a pair of pants on the floor, pulled out the leather belt, and then climbed on top of Henry. As Henry began to stir, the leader struck him several times in the face and then wrapped the belt around his neck and began to pull it tight. At the same time, the accomplice jumped on top of Janet and straddled her and began to beat her. Janet woke up and screamed and began fighting as hard as she could to get free, and one of Janet's wild punches caught the accomplice in the nose, causing them to reel back in surprise. And as a result, the accomplice and Janet both tumbled out of the bed onto the floor. By this point, the leader had finished with Henry, so they climbed off the bed and rushed around to help the accomplice. Together, they grabbed Janet and pinned her down, and then the leader climbed on top of her. Then the leader struck her several more times and then wrapped their hands around her neck and squeezed. The leader felt Janet go limp, at which point they said, "That should do it," as they climbed off of her. The killers looked at their handiwork and turned to go. On their way out, though, the accomplice spotted Janet's ring sitting on the nightstand, and they recognized one of the rings in an instant, and the sight of it made them furious. So, the accomplice impulsively grabbed both rings and stuffed them into their pocket, then turned and dashed out of the room along with the leader. The killers had only been gone a few minutes when Janet regained consciousness, feeling excruciating pain across her body. She could hear the strange, horrible rattling hiss and didn't know what it could be. Even as she lay there, her mind was already struggling to bury the horrible trauma she had just experienced. That's why she didn't remember until her hypnosis session that she'd actually been attacked by 2 people, and that one of them was actually somebody that she knew. It would turn out the killers were John Whiteley and Leila Hodges, the couple from the domestic abuse call. And just as Brewer and Muncie had suspected, these 2 did have a personal connection to the victims. However, the connection was not really to Henry, it was to Janet. When the detectives reviewed their case file, that single word that stuck out to them was Leila's maiden name. Leila had been married several times and had taken multiple last names, but she'd been born Leila Scott. She was no stranger to Janet. She was Janet Scott's stepdaughter. Leila was the daughter of Janet's late husband, Roe, from his first marriage. She grew up in the house on Mirror Lake where Janet and Henry lived together, and she hated them because she always thought that house should have gone to her when her dad died. Leila felt similarly about Janet's diamond ring. It was the same ring her father had given to his first wife, Leila's mother, which means, all along, the detectives were wrong about their most basic assumption. Henry was not the primary target of the attack. Janet was. And Leila's deep hatred of Janet explained the brutality of the attack. As a small older man, Henry didn't stand a chance, and Janet was lucky to be alive. She was beaten and choked so badly that her larynx was crushed. That horrible wheezing hiss she heard when she woke up on the floor, that was her own labored breathing. Once Detective Brewer and Muncie put this all together, they had John and Leila arrested. John's DNA was tested, and it matched the DNA found on the cigarette butt that was at the crime scene. The leader during the actual attack itself was John, and Leila was the accomplice. However, the true mastermind behind this attack was Leila. The couple took a plea deal and received a sentence of 20 years. As for Janet Scott, her physical and psychological trauma persisted for much longer than 20 years. Her voice and eyesight never completely returned to full strength. Fortunately, though, her beloved dog, Kissy, would make a full recovery and lived a long, happy life. On the night of January 31st, 1910, an American couple living in London, named Belle and Dr. Harvey Crippen, were hosting a small dinner party for 2 of their friends. The group had just finished their food, and they were now in the middle of a game called Whist, which is a card game, when suddenly Belle put her cards down and she stood up to tell a story. And Dr. Crippen saw his wife doing this and kind of knew what was going to happen, and he kind of gestured for her to not tell the story and please sit down and play this game, but she just kind of waved at him dismissively, like, please, leave me alone, I'm going to do what I want to do. Dr. Crippen sighed and just kind of sat back and let this happen. Anywhere they went, he knew his wife had to be the center of attention, and there was just nothing he could do. Dr. Crippen was a pretty passive guy who kind of got walked all over, especially by his wife. He was kind of little, he had big bulging eyes and huge glasses he wore, and his job was he basically sat inside of a dentist's office and mixed medicines for the dentist. And so he was just kind of like this anonymous, forgotten about guy that worked in a back office hidden from the world. Meanwhile, his wife, Belle, is like this beautiful woman, huge personality. She's an aspiring actress and singer, and everywhere they went, everybody loved her and basically didn't notice Dr. Crippen. Also, Belle would basically spend all of Dr. Crippen's money on her very expensive wardrobe. And so Dr. Crippen is just so annoyed. He's sitting on the couch and he's watching as Belle has now stood up in her big flowing pink evening dress, and she's regaling the guests with this big story of hers. And at some point, she just kind of transitions from telling the story to performing this bizarre song and dance routine that was the story. It's like she came up with a play in real time and performed it for the guests. And the dinner guests who were watching this performance, their names were Paul and Clara, they were totally entranced by what Belle was doing. They thought it was incredible. Paul and Clara were both theater people like Belle was. Paul was a former comedian, and Clara worked with Belle at their charity, which was called the Music Hall Ladies Guild.
And so Dr. Crippen just kind of scowled as the two dinner guests applauded really loudly for Belle's big performance. And Belle, she smiled and kind of giggled and then sat down and said, "Thank you so much." And then, Dr. Crippen, he's thinking, okay, now that she's done with this performance, we can finally play the card game that I really want to play. But Dr. Crippen, after grabbing his cards, looked around and could tell that they were not going to play cards. The big performance by his wife had eaten up all the rest of their time, and now it was too late and the guests had to leave. Before Dr. Crippen could even stand up to begin picking up in the room to get ready for this visit to end, Belle, his wife, was demanding he go outside and get their guests a horse and carriage to bring them back home. And so Dr. Crippen just kind of put his head down and said, okay. And as he was walking towards the front door to get the horse and carriage, Belle yelled after him, "And don't get one of those cheap ones. Get an expensive one, a nice one." Dr. Crippen just kind of rolled his eyes, but said, okay, and then he walked outside. But despite looking all over the place, there were no nice horse and carriages. It was just the kind of loud, rickety, bad ones that his wife did not want him to get. But after looking all over the place for a full hour and not finding a nice one, Dr. Crippen finally just had to hail one of the bad horse and carriages. He called them over and then he went back inside. And he told the guests, okay, I got your horse and carriage. And so they came outside, and so did Belle. And Belle's looking at this carriage after this long delay, and it's this terrible carriage. And she just stares at Dr. Crippen, furious. The guests don't seem to mind. They just walk down the stairs, they get in their carriage, they say goodbye, and they take off. But the second Dr. Crippen had turned back around, Belle was already back inside their home. And so he knows, as soon as he goes in there, he's going to get yelled at. And so he went inside the home, and in the living room was Belle, arms folded, just staring at him, absolutely furious. And she began laying into him about not only how ridiculous it was that it took him a whole hour to find the carriage, and it was a terrible carriage, something she said not to do, and she told him that he was the reason their whole dinner party had been a total disaster. Even though Dr. Crippen was like, I think it went pretty well. But in Belle's mind, her husband was the reason this party had totally failed. He was boring, he didn't contribute anything, and she told him that she caught that he did not applaud nearly as loudly as Paul and Clara had for her big performance, and that really hurt her feelings. When Dr. Crippen just didn't say anything, he just kind of knew to keep his head down and let his wife talk. When that happened, Belle got so frustrated, she kind of huffed and then turned around and walked over to the mantelpiece, and she took this framed photo that she shamelessly left up in their house that was of her former lover who she openly had had an affair with. It was this beautifully handsome, square-jawed prize fighter who, again, Dr. Crippen knew his wife had cheated on him with. And so Belle, she takes this photo and she holds it up and she points right at him and she looks at her husband and says, I can get any man I want. Look right here. I can get him if I want to. I don't need you. But Dr. Crippen was not affected by this. He was completely used to being treated this way by Belle. And so again, he just stayed silent and took what she was throwing at him. And so again, Belle gets even more frustrated because she's not getting a reaction from Dr. Crippen. She finally just goes, you know what? I'm going to leave you tomorrow. I'm done with you. I can't be with you. It's over. And again, Dr. Crippen just didn't react. I mean, this really was typical behavior for his wife, even this threat of leaving him tomorrow. She had done this before, but never followed through on it. It was just kind of like Dr. Crippen was her punching bag, basically 24/7. And so for now, all Dr. Crippen really wanted was for his wife to just stop ranting and raving so he could just go to bed. He didn't really care what she was saying. Frankly, he wouldn't even care if she did leave him the next day. He was totally unhappy in this marriage, as obviously she was, but he was so scared of scandal, he couldn't bring himself to divorce his wife. But if she actually followed through and left him, he'd be free. The marriage would be over and it would be her fault. And so Dr. Crippen just stood there waiting for his wife to finish, but it was clear she had a lot to say. Even after threatening to leave him, she just kept on laying into him about all his faults. And then at some point, Dr. Crippen just totally caught her off guard by interjecting and saying, "Hey, Belle, do you want some whiskey?" And Belle just kind of stopped and stared at her husband inquisitively. And then it was like her whole mood changed. And she was like, actually, yeah, I'll take some whiskey. And so Dr. Crippen said, great, I'll go make it. And he walked over to the liquor cabinet and he poured both of them a drink. 2 days later, the members of the charity that Belle and Clara, the dinner guests, were a part of, the Music Hall Ladies Guild, they were all sitting in their office in London waiting to start their meeting.
But there was a problem. Belle, who was their treasurer and therefore needed to be at this meeting, was not at this meeting. She was late and nobody knew where she was. And so after they sat in this office for a while, just waiting, they finally heard a knock on the door. And so one of the women got up, they opened up the door, and standing outside is Dr. Crippen's assistant, this young woman named Ethel, and she looked kind of frazzled and maybe a little bit out of breath, and she was carrying a letter and a package in her hands. And so Ethel would tell the woman who opened the door that she was here on behalf of Dr. Crippen and also Belle. And so the woman who opened the door said, okay, come on in. And so Ethel walked into the office and she placed the letter and the package on the table, and then she quickly turned around and left. After she was gone, the guild members kind of looked at each other confused and then just reached out and they grabbed the letter, they opened it up and they read it. And the letter was written by Dr. Crippen, and he was telling the members of this guild that unfortunately one of Belle's family members back in America had fallen ill, and so Belle had to go back to America and take care of this person, and she'd be gone for at least several months. And then when they opened up the package that Ethel had dropped off, that contained the guild's checkbook and also their ledger. That way they'd be able to go out and find a new treasurer to replace Belle. And so when they had finished reading this letter and seeing the contents of this package, the members of this guild just kind of looked at each other, not really sure what to do. You know, it seemed odd that Belle had not told them she was doing this, that she had left without saying goodbye. But at the same time, it seemed like whatever she was dealing with in America was very serious. And so they decided the only thing they could do was to just hire a temporary treasurer and wait for Belle to come back. About 3 weeks later, Clara and the rest of the Ladies Guild members hosted their annual ball. And like always, they invited Belle, as well as her husband, Dr. Crippen, even though they knew, this invitation was kind of a formality because Belle was still in America. But Dr. Crippen would show up to this ball, and he would not show up alone, and it caused a bit of an outrage. On Dr. Crippen's arm was very obviously his date. Ethel, his assistant, the young woman who had dropped off that letter and the package to the members of the guild about Belle's sudden departure. Clara stared incredulously at Dr. Crippen and Ethel as they kind of swayed around the room dancing. I mean, Clara just could not understand what was going through Dr. Crippen's head. How could he possibly think it was appropriate to so openly cheat on his wife around all of his wife's friends and in such a public place? It just seemed unfathomable that anybody would do what Dr. Crippen was doing. And so that night, Clara and the other members of the Ladies Guild, they got together and they decided that, because of Dr. Crippen's obvious infidelity, they could not invite him to be a part of anything to do with the Ladies Guild, at least not until they talked to Belle again when she got back. But Belle didn't come back, and she never wrote to any of the members of the guild or any of her friends. She just disappeared. And on March 20th, 1910, so roughly 2 months after Belle supposedly fled to America, Dr. Crippen came out and said he had just gotten some terrible news. It would turn out his wife, Belle, had fallen ill while in America, and she had died. When Clara and the rest of the Ladies Guild members heard about this, their disgust at Dr. Crippen's cheating quickly turned into suspicion that maybe he had something to do with Belle's early demise. So one of the members of this guild went to the police and reported Belle missing. However, at first, the police were not inclined to pursue this case because from their perspective, there was no evidence of a crime committed here. All they knew was this woman, Belle, had died in America, supposedly from natural causes. And so the only thing that was contrary to that were Belle's friends who basically were saying, well, maybe she was murdered by her husband because her husband was cheating on her. And the police were like, that doesn't line up. Just because he was cheating on her does not mean he killed her. But Belle's friends continued to keep the pressure on police. And finally, after 3 months, the police would assign a detective. His name was Walter Dew. And Inspector Dew had been a detective for more than 20 years. And he had even worked on the very famous serial killer case, Jack the Ripper, and had been one of the people who actually found the last body, although the Jack the Ripper case had gone unsolved. But coming out of that investigation, Walter Dew had really developed a great reputation as a really good detective. And so to have him lead this case was a big deal.
And so on the afternoon of July 6th, 1910, so roughly 5 months after Bell had gone missing, Inspector Dew, as one of his first things he would do for this case, went to Dr. Crippen's house to ask him about his wife. Now, Inspector Dew expected that Dr. Crippen would tell him the same story he had told everybody else about Belle, which is, she had to go to America to take care of this sick relative, and while she was over there, unfortunately, Belle passed away. But what Dr. Crippen ultimately told Inspector Dew was not that. Now, at first, Inspector Dew just asked Dr. Crippen a lot of basic questions about his wife, but Dr. Crippen seemed really awkward as he answered these questions. He actually almost seemed really embarrassed. And Inspector Dew clearly noticed this, but just kept on asking these routine questions and just allowed Dr. Crippen to act however he was going to act. But at some point, Dr. Crippen just stopped answering the questions altogether, and he paused for a minute with his head in his hands, and then he took off his glasses, he put them on the table, and then he looked up at Inspector Dew, and he said, I should just tell you the truth. Belle isn't dead. Dr. Crippen told the inspector that the day following that dinner party they hosted with Paul and Clara, that morning when Dr. Crippen woke up, his wife was gone, and all her things were gone too. She had packed up in the middle of the night and left without telling him where she was going. And so Dr. Crippen realized his wife had finally made good on the threat to leave him. Dr. Crippen said he lied about what happened to Belle because he was trying to avoid a scandal. He said that, while Belle was horrible to him personally and really mistreated him, she was really kind of amazing with everybody else, and everybody else loved her. And so Dr. Crippen really believed that lying about this would ultimately save her reputation and his own. So it was a win-win. And once Dr. Crippen was relatively sure Belle was not going to be coming back, that she really had left him for good, that was when he began openly dating Ethel, because he had actually been in love with his assistant Ethel for a long time, and he felt like now, with his wife out of the picture, he could finally love her out in the open, even though he admitted, nobody would actually understand the dynamic here, because everybody else thinks Belle is over in America, and here I am cheating on her. But, Dr. Crippen insisted to the inspector that this was the truth. He was not cheating on Belle. He didn't have anything to do with her disappearance. She left of her own accord, and here he was. And so after Dr. Crippen explained all this to the inspector, Dr. Crippen just put his face in his hands and just looked so ashamed and embarrassed, to the point where Inspector Dew really believed Dr. Crippen. I mean, this is a guy who has just poured his soul out about some of the most embarrassing things of his entire life, so he's got to be telling the truth. Also, Inspector Dew couldn't help but think to himself that Dr. Crippen was this little kind of passive-seeming guy who did not really seem capable of killing somebody else. But at the same time, Inspector Dew could definitely see a woman like Belle leaving Dr. Crippen the way that she did. Still, just to be thorough, Inspector Dew asked Dr. Crippen if he wouldn't mind allowing the inspector to search the property, because after all, this is a missing person case, and so we gotta check everything. Dr. Crippen said, absolutely, search my house, do whatever you gotta do, and Inspector Dew would do just that. He went all over the house, looked everywhere, and he would find nothing. So the inspector told Dr. Crippen that as of now, he believed his story and that basically the case was closed, but Inspector Dew really needed to talk to Belle in order to officially close the case, because right now, everybody thought she was dead, no one had heard from her, and so that was the one missing piece. And so Dr. Crippen said that was totally fine, and he and the inspector actually worked together to draft up this little advertisement that would go in newspapers in America that basically would say, hey Belle, if you see this, you need to contact police in London because we're looking for you. And so after the two men had come up with the language they wanted for this advertisement, Inspector Dew thanked Dr. Crippen, said he'd be in touch, and then he left. But 5 days later, when Inspector Dew went to follow up with Dr. Crippen, he discovered that Dr. Crippen and his new lover, Ethel, his assistant, were both gone, and nobody knew where they were. And this changed everything about the Belle case. Inspector Dew couldn't help but think, Dr. Crippen and Ethel look like they're running from something. So probably they lied to me about their involvement with Belle's disappearance.
And so Inspector Dew sent physical descriptions to all the newspapers and police stations all across Europe, and also he made a note to check all the ships that were bound for America in case Dr. Crippen and Ethel had decided to flee Europe that way. And while this big manhunt was just getting underway, Inspector Dew and his team went back to Dr. Crippen's house to do a much more thorough search. So police descended on Dr. Crippen's beautiful 3-story home on a quiet street, and they went inside and they tore apart everything. They flipped over mattresses, they opened up drawers and closets, they threw everything out, but they found nothing suspicious. But at some point, Inspector Dew, who was feeling really annoyed that he'd been totally duped by this doctor, he was walking down the basement steps in Dr. Crippen's house, and as he went down, he saw there were other investigators already in the basement conducting yet another fruitless search. But as Inspector Dew kind of turned the corner at the base of the basement stairs, he noticed the bricks that were laying in front of the fireplace that was in the basement just looked a little bit off, like they were maybe too new or something. And so just kind of acting on a hunch, he walked over to these bricks that were laid out right in front of this fireplace, and he's looking at them, and he grabs a poker, one of the pokers you use to move the logs around in a fire, and he just began tapping on each of the individual bricks right in front of them. And with every tap, he would hear the solid thump sound that you're hitting something hard that is beneath this brick. But as he went along hitting each of these bricks, he eventually reached the kind of center of these bricks, and when he brought that poker down on one of those bricks, it made a hollow sound. Clearly, there was something underneath these bricks. And so Inspector Dew is super excited. He calls for his team to come over, and one by one, they begin pulling up all these bricks. And after they're all gone, they see there's this perfectly smooth layer of clay that these bricks were sitting on top of. And so Inspector Dew called for a shovel. A guy brought one over, and Dew, he took one scoop with the shovel, and immediately this horrible smell began coming out of the ground that was so gross that the guys around Inspector Dew began retching and vomiting, and before long, the entire group of investigators had basically fled the basement to get away from this horrible smell. But after composing themselves, Inspector Dew and the rest of his team put handkerchiefs over their nose and their mouths, and they went back into the house, down into the basement. They grabbed that shovel, and they continued to dig, and after just a couple of scoops, they saw what was causing this terrible smell. In this clay pit, this hole in the basement underneath the bricks, were all these human body parts in the ground. But there were no arms, there were no legs, there was no head. All you had were just the internal organs of somebody, and then also there was like a blanket of skin that looked like it had been extracted from somebody's body with near surgical precision. Now, the police could not, based on these limited remains, make an actual positive identification of who exactly this was, but they did find in this pit, along with the organs and the skin, were several strands of hair that matched Belle's. There were several pieces of pajamas that belonged to Dr. Crippen, and then also on that skin fillet they found, there was a distinctive birthmark on it that matched the one that Belle had. Also, investigators were able to determine that inside of the intestines that were found in this hole were traces of a particular kind of tranquilizer that in the weeks leading up to Belle's disappearance, Dr. Crippen was making that particular tranquilizer at his work. He mixed medicines for dentist offices. That was the tranquilizer he was working with right before Belle disappeared. Shortly after these shocking discoveries were made, Dr. Crippen and Ethel were found on a boat trying to flee the country that way, and so they would be arrested, and so ultimately Dr. Crippen would be found guilty of murdering his wife, and he would be sentenced to death. As for Ethel, she would be acquitted of any participation in the crime. However, this was not the end of the story. Far from it. 100 years later, in 2010, a forensic scientist from Michigan State University fished out a piece of tissue from the remains found in Dr. Crippen's basement that had been preserved inside of a London museum. Now, this murder case had been officially closed since 1910, but the bizarre details of this case had never really fully made sense to a lot of people. Like, they didn't understand how or why Dr. Crippen had successfully disposed of his wife's head, her arms, her legs, all her bones. Those are all gone. Nobody ever found those.
But he decided to keep her organs and her skin buried in his basement under loose bricks. That doesn't make any sense. Also, if Dr. Crippen killed his wife by poisoning her, which is what is suggested from all that tranquilizer that was found in her intestines, that basically he overdosed her, then why did he dismember her afterwards? The reason killers often kill with poison is because it makes the victim's death look a bit more natural. Whereas if you mutilate someone's body, then obviously someone did it and you're calling suspicion on yourself. And so did Dr. Crippen poison his wife and then just throw that out the window and mutilated her body anyways? It just didn't make sense. So this forensic scientist from Michigan State University decided he was finally going to get some answers to this case. And so what he did is he compared the DNA from the tissue he dug out to the DNA of one of Belle's grandnieces. And when he compared the two, he saw they didn't match, which meant the body that was found in Dr. Crippen's basement was not Belle's. But that wasn't even the weirdest part. It was determined following this test by this forensic scientist that the body in Dr. Crippen's basement wasn't even female. It was a male. But to this day, no one has ever been able to identify who that body was, and Belle was never found. All we know is an innocent man, Dr. Crippen, was put to death for something he didn't do. At around 9 p.m. on Saturday, October 15th, 1988, a 33-year-old woman named Cheryl Petrie grabbed a candy bar off the rack inside of PJ's Market. PJ's Market was a little convenience store in the city of Port Orchard, Washington, and it was where Cheryl worked. She was the cashier. And without ringing this candy bar up, Cheryl simply handed it across the counter to a female college student who had just come into the store to talk to Cheryl. This student had temporarily moved right next door to PJ's Market, and the student, after coming into the market and meeting Cheryl, they had immediately taken a liking to her, and so it became kind of like her routine to come into the market basically every night and just sit down and chat with Cheryl, sometimes for hours. The student would talk about their day at school, they'd talk about their personal life, they'd tell Cheryl all of their problems and secrets. I mean, Cheryl really became this student's confidant. And believe it or not, this was an effect that Cheryl had on lots of people. Cheryl was incredibly kind, she was empathetic, she was a great listener, she never acted like she was judging you, and she never gossiped about people. And also Cheryl had a very disarming sense of humor. It was very goofy, she was always cracking up at jokes that she had made, and so people just felt at ease around Cheryl. And they typically left interactions with her in a good mood. And on this night, when the student had come into the market, they had told Cheryl that they actually had found an apartment in Port Orchard that they were going to be moving to, so they were going to be leaving PJ's where they were now. But the student had said that they really had no money, and so it was going to be a challenge to furnish this apartment. Heck, it was going to be a challenge just to buy groceries for this apartment. And when Cheryl heard this, she first congratulated the student, but then also said, well, hey, I'll give you some of my own furniture because I don't need it all, and that will help you furnish the apartment. And then also Cheryl had grabbed that chocolate bar off the rack and given it to the student for free as a sort of like, here's your first grocery as well. The student was totally floored by Cheryl's generosity and tried to tell her, keep your furniture and you can keep this chocolate or I'll pay for it. But Cheryl insisted. She was like, nope, tomorrow I will bring you furniture and please take this candy bar. And so the student finally relented and thanked Cheryl profusely. And really, this behavior was so typical of Cheryl. She was a single mom raising a 9-year-old girl and a baby boy, and so she worked 2 jobs to make ends meet. On the weekends, she worked at PJ's Market, and then during the week, she worked at a Ford car dealership. But despite being totally swamped basically all the time providing for her family, any spare time Cheryl had, she tried to give it to other people. Whether that was helping a coworker with their resume or baking some goodies for a sick friend at church, Cheryl was all about helping other people. The area of Port Orchard where Cheryl lived was only about an hour away from the big city of Seattle, but to Cheryl, this part of Port Orchard felt much farther away than that. She lived in this tiny little blue single-story house that was tucked away in the woods, surrounded by all these tall trees. The road to her house was very rural and winding, and so where she lived felt very isolated. It was a beautiful area, no doubt, but it was also kind of a bad neighborhood. In fact, a man had been shot and killed not far from Cheryl's house just a year earlier. But this home was all she could afford. Basically, Cheryl was poor and had almost nothing of her own. But whatever she did have, she was far more likely to give away than keep for herself. Eventually, Cheryl would tell the college student that she really needed to get back to the other customers and kind of do her job and not just sit here and chat this whole time. And so the student said, thank you again for the candy and for the offer of the free furniture. And then the student left the store, at which point Cheryl reached into her pocket and grabbed some change and dumped it in the register to pay for the candy bar. Even though Cheryl knew she very likely could have gotten away with simply giving out the candy and not paying for it, Cheryl was unfailingly honest, and so she knew she wanted to pay for the candy. Cheryl would man the register until 11 p.m. that night, chatting with many more regulars who came in and out, and then at 11 p.m., Cheryl locked the front door, and then she checked the register to make sure it was all balanced and all the cash was in there, and then by 11:15, she was calling her boss to report that her shift had gone fine and that she was taking off for the night. After Cheryl had left and locked the store behind her, she made her way out to her beat-up silver sedan car that was parked outside, and then she began the drive back home, knowing that she'd be right back to PJ's the very next morning, right when it opened at 7 a.m. At the same time that Cheryl was wrapping up for the night and making her way home, her ex-husband, Roland Pitre, who lived on the other side of town, was very excited. This was the night that Roland was going to win back Cheryl. Roland glanced at his watch and saw it was just past 11 p.m., and so it was almost time. He imagined how happy Cheryl would be when he unveiled his big surprise. She would run to him, and he would hold her and tell her how much he loved her and how he had always loved her. Roland hadn't yet figured out how he was going to explain his big plan to win back his ex to his current girlfriend, but he figured he would just work that out later. The most important thing for Roland right now was showing Cheryl how wrong and stupid he had been, and how much he needed her, and how much she needed him. Also, he knew their kids would be totally thrilled if they got back together. Roland was looking after their son and daughter that weekend, and he had seen firsthand that his daughter was clearly very upset about the fact that her parents were split up. Roland and Cheryl had a very complicated history, but Roland knew, really, their breakup was his fault. They had met about 12 years earlier when Roland had been on leave from the military. At the time, Roland was a Marine sergeant, and he was also a very accomplished judo instructor. He was handsome and charismatic, and he had a charming Creole accent because he had grown up in a Cajun French family near New Orleans. But despite how appealing Roland looked, he actually was kind of a terrible romantic partner. Every woman he had ever been with, he had cheated on and then made up elaborate lies to cover it up. But regardless, Cheryl had fallen head over heels in love with Roland. And part of the reason that happened was because Cheryl was actually pretty insecure. She had long auburn hair and beautiful blue eyes and this amazing personality. But to Cheryl, she felt like she was kind of plain looking, and she also felt like she was kind of chubby, and she got the sense that men kind of did not find her all that attractive. And when she met Roland, she saw right away that the other women he had been with were these overtly glamorous and beautiful women. And so when she noticed Roland taking an interest in her, I mean, it was incredible. She felt so lucky. And so Roland and Cheryl had gotten married, they'd had their daughter together, and then basically right away, Roland had begun cheating on Cheryl. They ended up getting divorced 8 years earlier in 1980, and it was right around this point that Roland really just totally blew his life up. The woman Roland was cheating on Cheryl with was also married, and so Roland came up with this plot to murder this woman's husband. And the husband would get murdered, but when Roland was on trial, the prosecutors couldn't really untangle what his actual role was in the murder. It was not clear if he really was the guy who did the killing, or if he simply had kind of come up with the idea and other people had done it. And so ultimately, Roland was found guilty for his role in this murder, but he was only sentenced to 6 years in prison. And strangely enough, it was actually during this time that Roland was in jail that he and Cheryl kind of came back to each other. While Roland was behind bars, he had this epiphany that Cheryl was the best thing that ever happened to him, and he totally screwed it up. And so he began writing her letters, telling her how much he loved her and how sorry he was for being unfaithful. And also he began explaining that, the charges he was found guilty of in connection to this murder were totally not true, that he had been screwed. And Cheryl had eventually begun writing back to Roland, telling him that she still loved him too. And they actually would get remarried while Roland was in prison. And then when he got out of prison, he moved in with Cheryl and their daughter in Port Orchard, and they would have another baby together, their son, and then also Roland enrolled in nursing school. And so for a time, this family was back together and everything was great. But eventually, Roland went back to his old ways and began cheating on Cheryl again, and before long, the couple had separated again and began living separately. And so fast forward back to the night of October 15th, 1988, and Roland is anxiously waiting to begin this big plan to win Cheryl back, and he glances at his watch and he sees it's now 11:30 p.m., which means it's go time. And so Roland, he stands up really quickly and begins walking towards the front door of his house when suddenly he feels so lightheaded that he actually falls back on the couch and passes out cold. Roland had serious blood pressure issues, and sometimes if he stood up too quickly, it would make him feel really dizzy and he would faint. And so that's what happened. And then at some point after he fainted, Roland kind of came to, but he was in such a fog mentally that instead of, going out and doing this big plan to win Cheryl back, he just kind of wandered his way upstairs and climbed in bed with his girlfriend and fell asleep for the rest of the night. Cheryl was due back at PJ's Market the next morning at 7 a.m. She was going to open the store and also drop off that furniture with the college student. But when the first customers, including that college student, arrived at PJ's Market, they saw the door was locked and the lights were off inside. Now, all of these customers knew Cheryl really well, and they really liked her, and they knew she should have been there by that point. This was totally uncharacteristic of Cheryl to not be there on time, and so it wasn't long before these patrons began calling Cheryl at her home. But Cheryl never picked up. However, remember, this is 1988, so people didn't have cell phones, they used landlines, and so it was totally normal to periodically call someone and not have them pick up. It just meant they weren't home. Now, at first, people in Port Orchard just kind of assumed that, there must be a rational explanation for why Cheryl is not at work. Maybe there was a family emergency, maybe her car didn't start, but there had to be some sort of reasonable reason for her absence. Thank you to BetterHelp for sponsoring today's video. In 2017, when I left the military, my life came crashing down really quickly. The military had provided a lot of structure in my life, and so when I left, I lost all that structure, and it made me feel totally lost. But instead of trying to implement new structure and new routines into my civilian life, I just kind of went into a shell. I didn't leave my house much, I was mad all the time, I began lashing out at my family and friends. I was miserable. Eventually, my family and friends had a sort of intervention for me, and they encouraged me to see a therapist, and I would eventually agree to go, and thank goodness I did, because it totally changed my life. My therapist was able to explain to me that the reason I was acting the way I was and feeling the way that I was feeling was because I was depressed. And amazingly, it really took my therapist telling me that for me to actually see it. And then once I could see the issue, I was able to deal with it. Look, therapy is not for everyone, but it is a great starting point for people who feel lost and don't really know what to do. And if that's you, consider giving BetterHelp a try. BetterHelp is a highly reviewed online therapy platform, which means you can get the help you need right from the comfort of your own home. Get matched with a BetterHelp therapist after filling out a brief survey, then you can talk to your therapist however you feel comfortable, whether it's via text, chat, video call, phone call, or some combination. You can also switch therapists at any time for no additional cost. Go to our sponsor, BetterHelp.com/MrBallen for 10% off your first month of therapy with BetterHelp and get matched with a therapist who will listen and help. That night, Cheryl didn't show up at Roland and his girlfriend's house to collect her daughter and son. Now, Roland didn't know that Cheryl had missed work all day that day, and so he assumed Cheryl must just be running late. But by 6:30 p.m. that night, when still Cheryl had not arrived and she hadn't called, Roland finally called Cheryl, but she didn't answer. And so Roland just left Cheryl this very upbeat message on her answering machine and then waited for her to call back. But despite how cheerful this message was that Roland left, it kind of betrayed the way he actually felt. Roland was not happy. That morning, when he had woken up and realized he had slept through the night and not done the big plan to win Cheryl back, he felt so stupid. He had this chance to win her back, and he blew it. But over the next couple of hours, when Cheryl did not return Roland's call, he went from being solely worried about, how he blew this opportunity to win his ex-wife back, to now just being concerned about his ex-wife. Where is she? What's going on? And so late that night, Roland would actually call the police and report Cheryl missing. A deputy came out to Roland's house to take down this report, and then Roland actually gave the deputy a spare key to Cheryl's place, and then this deputy went to Cheryl's house. It was totally quiet. He knocked. There was no answer. He let himself inside using this spare key, and he found the home was totally in order. There was no sign of any disturbance whatsoever. The deputy eventually walked over to Cheryl's answering machine, and he saw there was a blinking light, which meant there were messages that had not been played yet. And so he hit play, and the first message was from Cheryl's daughter, who was calling to say goodnight and I love you. And then there were several messages from customers from PJ's Market that were calling to ask, why Cheryl was not at work and was she okay. There was a message from Cheryl's boss also asking, what's going on? Why aren't you at work? And then there was that message from Roland, who had called when she had not come to pick up the kids. And then the last message on the machine played, and when the deputy heard it, he knew something was terribly wrong. The last message was from a stranger who was calling Cheryl to be like, hey, I found your purse floating in Lake Union, which is near Seattle. And the stranger was like, I don't know if your purse was stolen and dumped here, or if you were here and you left it in the water or something, but I'd love to give the purse back to you. And the stranger left a phone number for Cheryl to call so she could come and pick up her purse. Lake Union was only about an hour away from Port Orchard, where Cheryl lived, but there was just no real reason she would ever be around Lake Union. She never went on trips. She didn't have the time or money to, even for short ones, like going to Lake Union an hour away. And then also, Cheryl's entire life was in Port Orchard, and her life was her kids, her jobs, and the church. And so there was just no logical explanation for why Cheryl's purse would be in Lake Union. But regardless, detectives from Port Orchard, along with police from Seattle, linked up and went out to Lake Union and began looking for Cheryl's car, because maybe she did go out here, maybe she did lose her purse in the water, and maybe she's still here. But Lake Union is a very busy place with lots of people and businesses living right along the water's edge, and even more people living right on the water in houseboats. And so there were literally thousands and thousands of cars all over Lake Union, so trying to find Cheryl's nondescript silver sedan took some time. But on the night of October 19th, so 3 days after Cheryl had failed to show up at PJ's Market for that 7 a.m. opening, police would find her car near Lake Union. And at first, it seemed like, Cheryl must have just driven here and abandoned the car for some reason, because there was no sign of a struggle inside or outside of the car. There was nothing strange about this car. It was just parked in a lot. But when authorities went around to the back of the car and used a screwdriver to pop open the trunk, they realized right away that that could not have been what happened, because Cheryl was in the trunk, and she was deceased and very clearly had been beaten to death. The investigation into Cheryl's murder would take more than a decade. The police started with Roland because 1, he was Cheryl's ex-husband, and 2, because Roland had previously been convicted for his role in a murder, even though the details of exactly what he did were never really clear. But Roland had an alibi that was airtight. He had witnesses that could confirm he was nowhere near Lake Union or Cheryl on the night that she was killed. And Roland was very cooperative with police after finding out what happened to his ex-wife. He was really bent out of shape. And so Roland very quickly signed paperwork to allow detectives to come into his home and search it and search all of his things. And he also began regularly contacting the police to offer up any information he could think of that could be useful, including an odd story he told about this young man that was following Cheryl around in the few days before she died. He didn't know much about it, but he knew there was something odd happening with this young man. Now, Roland didn't really have much more information than this suggestion that somebody was following her around, and so police were never really able to fully follow up on that lead. But police did interview virtually everybody in Cheryl's life, from her friends to her family to her co-workers at the Ford dealership and PJ's Market. They talked to people at church who knew her, and nobody really popped up as being very suspicious. Basically, everyone said, look, Cheryl was this incredible person who everybody seemed to love. It makes no sense that somebody would want to harm her. But a year after Cheryl's death, the police would get their first big break in this case. A newspaper journalist contacted the police to let them know that this random young man had contacted him and confessed to killing Cheryl and then hung up without giving his name or his location or how to get in touch with him again. It was almost like this person had called just to get this huge secret off their chest somewhat anonymously. The police convinced the journalist to actually write a story about this strange call he got to see if maybe they could flush out this young man who had just confessed. And when this article ran in the newspaper, one of Cheryl's old coworkers from the car dealership called the police to be like, hey, there was this young man who worked at this dealership with us and with Cheryl who was totally creepy and definitely had a thing for Cheryl. The coworker said this guy's name was Albie Brotsweller and that he worked in the garage and he was known as a kind of odd guy with a short temper who totally creeped out all the women who worked at the dealership. And this coworker would tell police that before Cheryl died, she had been working with Albie on his resume. And while they had been working together, Albie had developed this weird fixation on Cheryl. And when police began looking into Albie, they discovered he had quit his job at the dealership a day before Cheryl went missing, and then a couple of days after he had quit, so by this point Cheryl has been found murdered, one of Cheryl's colleagues said they saw Albie, and he had this really deep cut on his hand that he kept wrapped in a big bandage. Detectives would also discover that Albie's father lived right near PJ's Market, and Albie's mother lived right near the area where Cheryl's car had been found, out near Lake Union. And so suddenly, Roland's previously odd-seeming story about some random young man following Cheryl around before she was murdered made a lot of sense. It seemed like Albie was this strange young man Roland was talking about. When detectives tracked Albie down, he was sullen and totally uncooperative. But eventually, the police got him to talk, and he would tell them that he had cut his hand fishing. And so police rounded up all these people Albie said he had been fishing with when he cut his hand, and in separate interviews, all of those people confirmed that Albie was telling the truth. And also police knew that even though circumstantially Albie looked really suspicious, there was not a single shred of actual evidence that tied him to Cheryl's death. And so pretty quickly, Albie was let go, and the police at that point kind of hit a dead end in this case. And in fact, the case went totally cold at this point. And then, one day in 2002, so 14 years after Cheryl was murdered, a man in prison got word out to police that he actually knew exactly who killed Cheryl. He said the murderer's name was Frederick J. McKee, and that he was currently incarcerated for cooking meth. Now, we don't know exactly how this inmate knew Frederick was the killer, but this inmate who called police was cellmates with Frederick McKee, and so very likely he overheard Frederick say something incriminating, and so this inmate called the police. And so police got a DNA sample from McKee, and they compared his sample to the skin cells that were found on the duct tape that had been used to bind Cheryl's hands when she was killed, and unbelievably, it was a match. Frederick was the killer. But as police dug deeper, they quickly realized that, Frederick's heinous actions of actually killing Cheryl was not the worst part of the story. The story of what really happened to Cheryl Petre was so insanely nonsensical that right away, newspapers all over the country began to cover it. It was converted into a true crime documentary, and even a famous author wrote a book about it. I mean, this story really was just totally sensational. First, I'm going to give you the facts of what happened to Cheryl. And then I'm going to give you the absurd and tragic explanation for why these things happened to Cheryl. Late on the night of October 15th, 1988, so the night that Cheryl disappeared, the meth cook, Frederick J. McKee, ambushed Cheryl as she came home from PJ's Market. We don't know exactly where the ambush happened, but we think it happened right outside of Cheryl's home. And after he ambushed her, he forced her into her own trunk, he bound her hands, and then began savagely beating her. Now, based on her injuries, Cheryl obviously put up a big fight, kicking and punching and trying her best to get out of the trunk, but eventually Frederick had taken the actual metal of the trunk and began slamming it down on Cheryl's face, and that allowed him to overpower her and eventually beat her to death. And then after she was dead, he shut the trunk with Cheryl inside of her car, and then he drove her car all the way out to Lake Union, and then he abandoned the car with Cheryl still inside of it and chucked her purse into the water. But this terrible night was not supposed to go this way. Here's what was going on in the background. At the same time that Cheryl was closing up shop at PJ's Market and beginning her trip back home, her ex-husband, Roland, on the other side of town, was sitting in his house anxiously checking his watch, waiting for the right time to launch this big plan that was going to win Cheryl back. Roland's big plan was that he was going to save Cheryl's life. He had hired his buddy, Frederick J. McKee, the meth cook, who he had met in prison, and he had given Frederick a spare key to Cheryl's house. McKee was instructed by Roland to sneak into Cheryl's place before 11 p.m., so before she came home from work, and then when she got home, McKee was supposed to jump out and ambush her and tie her up and abduct her. Roland had actually gone with McKee to a hardware store to purchase the rope and duct tape that McKee would use to tie Cheryl up. But when McKee actually got to the point in the plan where he was physically removing Cheryl from her home to go take her who knows where, that was when Roland was going to jump in and save the day. And Roland had really thought about how this moment was going to go. He was going to kick the front door in and jump inside and scream at McKee, "You can't do this!" and then attack him with his judo skills until McKee ran off scared, at which point Roland would cut Cheryl free and she would grab onto him and say, "Oh my goodness, you saved me, I love you, I need you." And then after this, Roland believed they would get back together and they would live happily ever after. However, on the night of October 15th at 11:30, when Roland looked at his watch and saw it was time to go save his ex-wife, he stood up so quickly from the couch because he was so excited to go do this thing that he had one of his low blood pressure episodes and he fainted. And then when he came to a little while later, instead of going out the door to really at this point stopping this abduction from happening, Roland just kind of trudged upstairs and went to sleep. And this was a really big problem because Frederick J. McKee, the meth cook, he was hired to actually abduct Cheryl. He was not aware that this was actually a setup for Roland to come in and save the day. McKee literally believed Roland wanted him to abduct his wife. And he didn't ask any questions. He just said, "Okay, I'll do that." And then when Roland didn't show up, Frederick went through with the actual abduction of Cheryl. And during this abduction, things got out of hand and Frederick wound up beating Cheryl to death. Both Roland and McKee would be convicted for the murder of Cheryl Petrie. And by the time the cops had finally solved this cold case, Roland was actually already in prison for attempting to kidnap the son of another ex-wife in an effort to impress this ex-wife. It had not worked. Roland was ultimately sentenced to 40 years in prison, which was on top of the 25 years he was already serving, and McKee would get 20 years.
to cancel, yeah. And this time is romance. Every glance, sweet refrain. Together we'll remain. Moonlight glow, so bright, so true. Hey, hey, shining down on me and you. In your eyes, I see the spark. Love ignites here in the dark, the dark. Darkness under the stars, hearts alight, near and far. Feel the rhythm, feel the light. We own the night. I found my sheets to life, baby. My Japan, silver skin. Of I share its suspense. Will never run, see my love.
Once the news headlines fade about whatever terrible thing happened to them, the victims of violent crime and their families are often left to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives all on their own. This is why we started the MrBallen Foundation. It is a registered 501c3 charity whose sole purpose is to help these forgotten people. However, we can't do it alone. Since last year, with your help, we were able to raise and give away to victims of violent crime and their families over $500,000. And this year alone, our studio, Ballen Studios, is going to donate $1 million. And to be clear, the MrBallen Foundation does not